at the end of the day, if Bitcoin Core does not adapt to the demand for Bitcoin, it will be replaced by something that adapts to Bitcoin demand. There's two things. First of all, you're never going to reach your stated goal of preventing arbitrary on-chain storage. You're only going to limit it. Second of all, to not even
That was never my stated goal.
reach your stated goal, you're going to significantly alter Bitcoin's very core and how it works. And I don't think that most Bitcoin users would be very happy with this.
All right, so straight out of the gate, we have a straw man argument. That's disappointing because Antoine is, he wasn't someone that I debated at BTC++. I generally find him to have the more defensible positions here. He takes time and effort to write the things he does, but I still think he conveniently just doesn't get all the way to the ends of logical thoughts so that they sound reasonable, but the minute you add and apply more context to it, it just comes indefensible. But yeah, that's a very disappointing straw man to start with. No one has ever in this anti-spam side has ever pretended that you can ever prevent it, by which he's meaning make it so that there's no arbitrary data being stored on chain. That's not our stated goal because it's a crazy goal. It's a target. It's not, and if you fall short of the target, you're just better than if you'd done nothing. That's all. Less spam is better than more spam.
From Antoine Poinsot. Antoine is a Bitcoin Core developer, and we're going to be getting into this whole op return and spam question and filters and all these things. Obviously, it's quite controversial at the moment, but I thought it would be good to have people explain some different perspectives on this. So Antoine, first of all, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's set the context a bit. I understand there's different pieces to kind of understand here because this specific pull request and mailing list discussion relates to op return specifically, but there's also this broader sort of spam on the chain and filtering conversation, and maybe sometimes the wires get crossed a little bit there or arguments sort of go across from both sides. So do you want to just set the context from your perspective on the op return side of it and then the spam and filtering broader aspect of this?
Sure. So there is this question around tightening Bitcoin Core's release policy, which is not Bitcoin, but just Bitcoin Core standardized policy to filter inscriptions, which have been in use since 2023.
Just quickly explain the relay part and the consensus part.
He says Bitcoin Core, which is not Bitcoin. I find there's two perspectives on that. I find one of them is reality, one of them is ideology. Bitcoin Core is effectively Bitcoin. Even Bitcoin Knots is still basically Bitcoin Core. So, sorry, Stephan, to pause you in this horrific state. So, changing Bitcoin Core does in effect change Bitcoin. We know that.
Just for people who aren't familiar with that.
Yes. So, Bitcoin is defined by its consensus rules. That is what sets the incentives of actors in the Bitcoin system, of users, of miners, of everybody. Bitcoin Core not only is the reference implementation of consensus rules, but it's also, in addition, it does a lot more than just implementing the consensus rules. In particular, it's the backbone for a public relay of unconfirmed transactions. There is no consensus on unconfirmed transactions, otherwise we wouldn't need blocks. And for these unconfirmed transactions, there is tighter rules than consensus rules for whether Bitcoin Core is going to relay these transactions through its peer-to-peer relay network. The reason we have tighter rules for unconfirmed transactions is that, well, first of all, these transactions do not have any proof of work attached. So you basically have a software that listens to the entire world, where anybody with no identity can just send you transactions. And some of these transactions can be harder to validate or can indirectly lead your software to do a heavy amount of computation because it needs to rearrange its mempool or for other reasons. For these reasons, we have much tighter rules on these transactions for relay.
Yeah, let me just try and repeat.
No proof of work requirement to flooding someone's mempool with transactions. So we have relay policies which are more restricted than consensus. Yeah, I agree with all that.
Some of that just to make sure everyone's following along, and here's my understanding. You correct me if I'm getting anything wrong. So we have this concept of what is consensus valid, i.e. what goes into a block. There are kind of slightly looser rules for that, but there is a slightly tighter set of rules about that's known as policy or relay, and this set of rules is slightly tighter, and there are, as I understand, there are, I guess, two or three main reasons for that. One of them is known as DOS reasons, denial of service. So because of this DOS risk, as you pointed out, they don't have proof of work attached to them. That's one of the reasons why policy is a bit tighter than consensus. The other one I've heard of is that there are upgrade hooks. So to kind of help miners support kind of the upgrades in the future with soft forks, that's another reason. And then thirdly, as I understand, there's this kind of light deterrent or slight discouragement, but maybe this is a point of contention where some people see that as historically that was like a gentleman's agreement without real force behind it, and others see this like, no, actually, these spam filters do work. So can you just explain?
Well, they demonstrably work great because almost everything in the chain adheres to what this is. So this is why his point that Bitcoin Core is not Bitcoin is going to be something I'm going to have to keep pushing back on, because, yeah, you can't break consensus. That's an invalid block. But you can get around spam filters, but in almost all cases, spammers don't. So what you have by virtue of Bitcoin Core being so dominant and such a large, in practice, so much of what Bitcoin is just a result of what Bitcoin Core decide, or what happens in Bitcoin Core, that this gentleman's agreement, Stephan paints it as, or he says one side calls it that, is pretty rigidly enforced, and there's a reason for that, and that's the motivation for the whole relaxation of op return in the first place, is because it's actually really annoying to get around what is just a gentleman's agreement. If it was just a gentleman's agreement, then Citria could just break it, but it's not. This isn't just about Citria, it goes a lot more than that, but there's a reason they want nodes. They want Bitcoin Core to relax the filters and make it so that this stuff can get around trivially inside the P2P layer.
And a bit of your view there.
Yes, so maybe I can also just detail the second point, which is interesting, which might lead us into the third one. The second point is that by definition, when we make a soft fork on Bitcoin, we're going to make currently valid transactions by consensus invalid by consensus. And by virtue of having Bitcoin Core be basically the only implementation in use on the Bitcoin with on the Bitcoin network with real money behind, we could leverage Bitcoin Core standardness rules to have anything we are going to make invalid in a soft fork. We are going to try for it to be already invalid by Bitcoin Core standardness rules. This makes sure that any miner that is using Bitcoin Core standardness rules, which is all miners, will not include newly invalid transactions in its blocks after the soft fork. It makes it significantly safer to roll out the soft fork, because now we have very good guarantees that we are not going to have a chain that is healed by some hash rate with invalid transactions according to the soft fork rules after the soft fork. So we are not going to have users that can get tricked with confirmations in a chain that is not valid just because they have not upgraded. So, but this is a very nice property to have. It makes running out soft fork much, much safer. On the other hand, it's only a property that we can have because Bitcoin Core is the
it's like a dominant node implementation.
Yeah.
One other quick clarification.
Right, and to that effect, spam filters work unbelievably well as a result too.
For listeners, just when we're talking about relay policy and consensus, the other term that we're using here is standardness. So it means if something is considered standard, it means it's inside a policy, and a standard Bitcoin Core node will relay that on the public relay network of Bitcoin. And if something is non-standard, it means it is consensus valid, but not considered to be, that standard Bitcoin Core nodes will relay that on the network. So that kind of comes up later in the discussion about standardness versus non-standard. Okay, so so I guess we've spoken about the DOS aspect of it, the upgrade hook of it. Now let's talk a bit about the let's say the light deterrent or the gentleman's agreement. Can you explain your perspective on on that third component?
Yes. So historic.
It's not a light deterrent. I don't know why he's lowballing him so much. I know that Stephan is generally on that side, but the fact that you have almost everything in the chain be not just consensus valid, but not violate the spam filters in place in Bitcoin Core means that it's way more than a gentleman's agreement, and it's not just a light deterrent. It's really annoying for people that want to spam at scale to have to pay the extra cost, wait around much longer for blocks whilst dealing with pools that solicit this stuff out of band. It's way easier for those guys to just adapt their protocols to fit within the spam filters.
Typically, there has been little demand for anything that was outside of Bitcoin Core standardized rules.
Right. There has been little demand for stuff that falls outside the limits. If the road doesn't exist, there's no traffic on it because it doesn't exist yet. If you build the road by relaxing spam filters, then suddenly you'll have traffic on it. And this seems to be a point that has gone over everyone in Bitcoin Core's head, apart from Luke Dasher.
Therefore, we need to distinguish Bitcoin users and Bitcoin Core users. And Bitcoin users have had little economic demand for transactions that are outside of Bitcoin Core standardized rules. Therefore, Bitcoin Core could keep a fairly tight set of standardized rules. Then, back in 2013, I think, some people started using transactions that were standard according to Bitcoin Core, but created that imposed a significant negative externality on all node users. And these transactions were using fake public keys in outputs, which created forever unspendable outputs. In reaction to this, the Bitcoin Core developers standardized an output type, which is the up return output, which let these people, because there was economic demand behind this use case. Like Bitcoin Core could not, like the only reaction to it would have been to make it consensus invalid, which was not possible because you're not going to make public keys consensus invalid in Bitcoin. So second best option, try to standardize a way of doing this that is less harmful to all users. That was done with up return. Along with this caving, let's say, as some like to say, the up return output was, on the other hand, limited in size to try to say, well, if you are going to build your protocol, try to not include more than 80 bytes of arbitrary data in your output. And that's what people did, because they had, for newer protocol, people just used the standard ways of doing things because they just cooled. There was not much demand for using more data, and they could take advantage of the public relay network of unconfirmed transactions. So that's just the way they did it. So
okay,
that's
so a bit of the history.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple other questions. I think these are just kind of the...
There's nothing wrong with that explanation, but if you took that approach today, you'd blow all these people's minds, because apparently it just doesn't work in the way he's just fully admitted it worked back then. I mean, this was the olive branch, and again, none of us are trying to get rid of op return. Actually, there are people on my side that want to get rid of op return completely. But 40 bytes of op return is still allowed by default in knots, and it's reasonable in my opinion. You can do so much with it, and it's helpful that it exists, because the fact that spammers don't want to use it when you can do so much with it betrays their bad intentions. And the fact that playing ball with these guys and trying to move goalposts around to stop them using fake pub keys and to move them over to op return, but that they need more op return to do that. Trying to do that, I call it reverse whack-a-mole, because you're constantly trying to anticipate what spammers want and move things around in Bitcoin whilst signaling constantly that you're never going to ever do anything against what they do. You're just going to try and make life cheaper for them and hope that they do things in a less harmful way.
Upfront, kind of obvious questions that I think listeners will want to hear the answer. So, you know, and even I'll answer it as well from my perspective as well. I'm not paid by any spamming or shitcoining company as far as I'm aware. I do not hold any investments in any spamming or shitcoining companies. I hold Bitcoin, and I might occasionally invest in Bitcoin companies and have some equity in Bitcoin companies. That's at least...
I believe it. Stephan doesn't have a financial incentive here that I know of, not a direct one, to be shilling and being a spam apologist like he's been for the last couple of years. I think it's simply a case of trust the science with Stephan. He can't bring himself to look at what the core devs are saying and going, yeah, this is all nonsense. It's too difficult to do. And I understand the hesitation and the reluctance to go against all these geniuses like Greg Maxwell, but I'm looking at what they're saying, and if I can debunk their arguments, and I can do it over and over and over again, and just like with Jeff Garzik, when he started out based and turned into an absolute, well, he was a turncoat, you could always argue with Jeff Garzik by invoking earlier things Jeff Garzik had said. And it's the same with Greg Maxwell. We can go back to the Satoshi Dice era and look at the filtering he wanted to do to try and stop it. It was more aggressive than what Luke proposed. Because back then, we realized nodes were the boss, and miners just need to fall in line. And it wasn't that, we were much smaller and we were much more agile, but we still were basically just, in fact, NOTs was more dominant then in the mining space than Core was. Most of the blocks back then were mined by pools using Bitcoin NOTs, not using Bitcoin Core. We didn't care about that. Core is more dominant now, which means if they put in decent spam filters, they're going to work incredibly effectively, and spammers have then only got a couple of options. They modify their approach to either fit better with what Bitcoin's doing, they modify their approach to use a different crypto, which would be the ideal, or they try and do something, the most harmful method, which is using fake pub keys, and it costs more for them, and they have to continue raising money and gamifying their attack and getting other people to pay constant transaction fees to become enough, to operate at enough scale to be annoying for Bitcoin. And they have to maintain the money to do that, raising money from people that are going to keep asking them. Bitcoin doesn't seem to want us doing this. It keeps contorting itself, trying to prevent us from doing this, and we have to keep adapting. And every time we adapt, it takes us months to do it because we're operating at such a big scale. If that's the truth, then we can't afford to do this. It's a cat and mouse game, but we give them 3 months notice every time about where the mouse is going to be, and that's enough time for them to adapt.
From my perspective, do you want to answer that from your perspective?
Yes, I work on Bitcoin Core, so I'm very personally invested in Bitcoin's future. I have shares of my former company, Without Sardine, which is a Bitcoin security company, working on Livera, which is a wallet that already exists and does not need any changes to Bitcoin. I do not have any financial interest in JPEGs or whatever stupid things that people might be doing.
Gotcha. And there was another one, like a screenshot that's kind of going around.
Okay, so they both say we're not paid directly by spammers and we're not interested in spammers, and what the spammers are doing is stupid.
Because people were sort of arguing back and forth on this. So this particular pull request was opened by, as I understand, it was opened by Peter Todd on your request because he had opened an initial pull request 2 years ago in 2023, which was similar or the same PR. And apparently he was paid by Christopher Allen to do this. Are you able to explain from your perspective, is that a smoking gun from your perspective, or the arguments stand on their own merits? What's your perspective on that?
I don't know. I don't know why Christopher Allen paid Peter to open this pull request, and I didn't even look in Peter's original pull request. I knew it was, at the time, inscriptions that just came out, and I knew it would be unproductive to try to engage in the thread, so I was pretty dismissive. I felt like Peter Todd just wanted to trigger the filters enjoyers, and by saying it makes no sense. In a way, I agreed with him, but I was like, it's not a good use of my time to try to argue in his favor, not a good use of Bitcoin Core's GitHub repository to create a thread that is obviously going to be controversial at this time. So I did not engage, and I have no clue why Christopher Allen would even pay him for this.
Okay.
I don't know why Christopher Allen paid. There's no information on that. I think saying Peter Todd just had fun triggering people by doing it, it's potentially true because he's a troll kind of person, but at the same time, saying it doesn't matter and we just need to assess everything on the technical merits, that would be nice, but it's not really the world we live in. I am that naive. I do think that is technically achievable. I think we should just debate the ideas and forget about the people. That is my inclination to do it because I hate talking about who paid who and what the motivations might be and digging into who's owned by who and who's on whose salary and all that stuff. It's just annoying to me to have to do that stuff, but I know I'm dumb for that. I know that if you go and dig deep, you'll find all sorts of financial incentives that are corrupting the development process. Because why 2 years ago when Peter Todd wanted to do this, did the PR just get closed straight away? And now it's being forced through aggressively while Core's reputation is tanking. I'm sure if you scratch below the surface, you'll eventually find that there's some financial incentive there that would serve as a smoking gun.
Maybe there was a good reason as well. Like, I get paid to work on Bitcoin Core by people that, by the way, don't even tell me anything about what I should do or not. Many people do get paid on Bitcoin Core just for the simple reason that it's very hard and you're going to spend your days doing it. So if you want people to be working on this thing, they will need to be financed at the end of the day. And if people's getting financed or the source of the...
Yeah, but this just means you have to do what... You have to engage in this ridiculous group thing. Luke's never qualified for any of this stuff. He's been funded directly by the community rather than these companies like Chaincode and Spiral and Brink. And David Harding is, I'm pretty sure he's the sole reason for the fact that Luke was never able to get any funding from these big Bitcoin institutions. And when we finished raising funds for Ocean, David Harding went on a rant saying that, that money should have gone somewhere else. So that basically just utter gatekeeping. Like if there's a core dev like Luke who's contributed an unbelievable amount to Bitcoin, I don't like the guy. And not only am I going to block all funding for him, but I'm going to be furious that I wasn't able to control the $6 million that Ocean raised. That money should have gone to us, and we could have done something better with it. These are kind of psychopaths you're dealing with. The only guy that's able to step outside the thought bubble, this groupthink that's going on in core at the moment, is the guy that has historically brought Bitcoin back from the ledge multiple times when we were in deep trouble and everyone was doing everything wrong. Luke was the guy that came and fixed it. And it's just that exact same situation again with spam. Everyone in core is just off the deep end with idiot cowardice that they can justify with a bunch of out of context technical claims that Luke is standing up against, saying no. And I can't tell you how many times in Bitcoin we've been in this exact situation.
Finance is how we are going to judge changes. We have a much bigger problem than the size of return by 10,000.
Also, can you just distinguish for listeners this particular op return PR and the broader campaign on spam filtering, whether that's a good idea or not a good idea? Can you just explain your perspective and how people, or at least how you think of that, how you think of those two different things?
Yes. So just to give a bit of context, in 2023, people started using inscriptions, which were basically arbitrary data stored in a witness, in an input witness, the witness data being discounted by consensus and not by policy, like some people say. It's discounted.
That was me that said that. And it's, I got it wrong, but at the same time, I don't think it's really relevant to this. It just makes me look more like I'm technically clueless. But when you dig into it, it doesn't really make any difference. It is mining policy rather than mempool policy that is relevant here, in addition to witness data being discounted by consensus. All that is to say, a miner can just charge more for this stuff and make it equivalent and say, if you're doing inscriptions, you have to pay 1-to-1, not 0.25-to-1, because inscribers at the moment are getting disproportionate advantage of the witness discount. And they're bloating the UTXO set, and the whole point of the witness discount was to reduce the UTXO set. And like I keep saying on Twitter, this is really embarrassing because it was a very clever idea we had to make it cheaper to spend inputs, to consume outputs rather than to create outputs. And this is supposed to shrink the UTXO set. And inscriptions came along that took advantage of that. And because of the way inscriptions work, they bloated the UTXO set from 4 gigabyte to 12 gigabyte. And that just shows us that we have a technical solution, it's very elegant, and then we put it in the wild and it blows up in our face. And that is exactly what Core are doing at the moment. They cannot see the forest for the trees. They're technically brilliant, but they do not understand the context in which the decisions they are making will exist and the results of them. Just like I say, just like earlier when he's saying there's no economic demand for stuff that violates standardness. And I'm saying, well, if you change standardness, you will change the economic demand for things that currently aren't standard. And I made the prediction, if you change the op return limit, the standardness rules there from 80 bytes to 150 bytes or 100,000 like they want to do, you're going to see more op returns in the chain of that size. And this is self-evident. If you build the road, a few months later, there will be cars driving on that road. That's a reasonable assumption. And there weren't before you built the road. This is like primary school stuff. And it's so weird to have to put it in, to state it and to have to state these such obvious realities. And I'm not being ridiculous when I say that they somehow just seem to be blind to all this. Like, I'm really not. I'm not making straw mans. They're not going to say to me, oh yeah, look, we obviously know all that. You're putting this in the wrong context. You're being disingenuous. They genuinely just don't seem to realize this stuff.
By consensus, therefore, it's 4 times cheaper to store this data there, given that there is very little demand for using Bitcoin at all, it appears. These people just started storing whatever stupid things on chain, and they're starting to create a hype, and the hype brought more demands, which introduced more supply of such protocols. and triggered a large usage of the Bitcoin blockchain to store.
Yeah, nothing was done about it. So they basically had the red carpet rolled out for them. Bitcoin isn't going to do anything about this to defend itself. Let's go. And it grew and grew and grew. And now you're trying to dig up a road when there's 8,000 cars per minute driving down the thing. You can't even get the construction workers on there. Like,
store this data. At the time, some people believed that if Bitcoin Core was to try to tighten its standardness rules to make these inscription transactions that store arbitrary data in their input witness.
Yes, I was part of the group that wanted to do that. And we were told this is too controversial, you can't do it. And that was fine, annoying but fine, until the recent op return stuff, which was similarly controversial, but they didn't give a shit in that. Suddenly that was fine. We can actually merge controversial stuff. We don't just close those PRs because they're controversial. And this time we get called spammers. Ironically, they call us spammers when we go to the GitHub and say, I don't think this is a good idea, and give perfectly coherent reasons.
Valid by standardness. It would prevent, no, it would not prevent, that's not what they say. It would raise the cost to them to use them, and therefore they would go away and start using altcoins or whatnot to store their data.
Yep, that is an incentive.
Unfortunately, I believe it's incorrect. But it led.
There's no basis for that. It's correct. Definitionally, if you create obstacles for spammers, you make their life more expensive. That is just a linear it's not linear, but it is it's a correlation that you can't deny. If you start refusing to relay their stuff around the network, they have to adapt their protocol, which costs them money. It's the compatibility is annoying for them, like Jimmy Song pointed out. This guy has Ordinals wallet v0.16, that guy has Ordinals wallet v0.17, and there's a cross-compatibility issue there because they switched to a new method because Bitcoin did something annoying to them. That is a cost, and it's a disincentive to carry on using Bitcoin in a way that Bitcoin doesn't want to be used. You either adapt and use Bitcoin as it is, your whole scam just dies, or you go and do it on a scam coin. Those are your options. Or you have to just carry on using a pool that solicits this stuff out of band, and then you lose access to a ton of block space. Because if you only have Mara, suddenly you only have 18% of the block space you used to have. You just got 82% less efficient by virtue of the network saying, we're not going to relay this stuff around for you for free. And people saying, well, you can't just make a sweeping change that effectively. You can, because of the fact that we're basically centralized and because Bitcoin Core is basically Bitcoin. And pretending otherwise is silly.
It's to a lot of debate at the time. Fast forward to 2025, 2 years after 2023 and the inscriptions debate, Bitcoin Core still has the same standardness rules in this regard, not in others, but in this regard. The craze around inscriptions have mostly died off. Bitcoin block space usage is back to what it was before, which is pretty low. And
it's worse than it was before all this because people that were trying to do monetary stuff on Bitcoin kept having to compete with pump and dumps that would make the mempools, that would make transaction fees incredibly unstable. They'd go up, 4 orders of magnitude for a week and then drop back down to nothing again. That organic adoption doesn't happen like that. And that basically just, you have the digital gold narrative is doing so well and Bitcoin is going up in price so much, but the permissionless medium of exchange thing is just absolutely that was struggling enough as it was, but having to compete with limited block space for people storing JPEGs in the chain and acting like that wasn't messing things up was just so reckless and irresponsible when it was perfectly feasible for us to come up with some countermeasures. It was written, it's implemented in knots, and it works.
And I suggest to standardize larger op-return outputs for very technical reasons. Some users of
It's not particularly technical. The reason they want bigger op returns and the surface rationalization for it is just because UTXO bloat from fake pub keys is worse. And in theory, op return is a little bit cheaper, so spammers will just use op return instead of fake pub keys. That is the surface level rationalization for it. It's not particularly technical because you can prune op returns, which means you have to run a prune node, by the way, which sucks and no one wants to do it. But in theory, it's prunable as opposed to fake pub keys, which are UTXOs, and you have to know all of them all the time. So UTXO set bloat is the worst form of spam. Everyone agrees on that. But are spammers just going to switch to op return because it's a little bit cheaper if we blow out the limit for it? No. All we're going to do is just get loads more op return, and the spammers like Citria are just, they barely have any incentive to switch anyway. He's trying to anticipate what they're doing by opening up op return filters before the use cases come around, in the hope that the spammers write their protocols in such a way as to use op return in the first place rather than fake pub keys. He's trying to play reverse whack-a-mole. It's exactly the description of what he's trying to do. They're trying to blow out this limit in anticipation of future spammers saying, hey, at least when you come along, can you use this method that we already opened up for you? Because it's not as bad. And I understand, again, it's a technical rationalization that anyone with enough intelligence can understand, but it's still cowardly, because you always have the other approach of, what if we treat these guys with hostility, refuse to relay their stuff around, implement their protocols in reverse, so that we can see how this stuff works, we can identify their activity. We don't need to figure out whether they're using fake pub keys or not. We can combat their spam on other levels. We can do it other ways. Luke did it in a half-an-hour presentation where he demonstrated how to create a spam filter specifically for Citria. And it doesn't sit there verifying whether pub keys are valid or not, which is, you know, the thing that we're told we're just never going to be able to do to thwart that kind of spamming. It just looks at the Citria protocol, and nodes look at that and say, oh, this shit I'm getting, you know, relayed to me from other nodes is to do with Citria. I don't want to relay this stuff. It's malicious. They're trying to bloat the UTXO set, or they're trying to fill up the chain with op returns. And, you know, they're barely using anything, Citria. They haven't used anything on chain yet that I know of. And even when they do, it's all a fail case. But I think throughout this video, he's going to downplay Citria's role here for a bunch of reasons. And that's ultimately why they're not pushing for op return of 150 bytes. They're pushing for op return of just completely limitless up to the next filter, which is 100,000 bytes.
Public relay networks want to be storing transactions in transaction outputs, which is not to store a large amount of data as it was the case for inscriptions back in 2023, because if they wanted to do so, they can already do so, and for 4 times less through the witness. What they want is a small amount of data in that transactions outputs, and it's something that they can already do by Bitcoin Core standardness rules. And they just do it by, again, same as in 2013, using fake public keys in outputs. So that's what they do today. I met with one of the founders of such.
So he's just saying they use fake pub keys because the inscriptions hack isn't cheaper yet. Inscriptions hack's only cheaper if they use over 150 bytes or something.
Protocol, or let's say an application, because it's a user of the Bitcoin relay network. And he just told me that they were doing this. And I was like, no, that's bad. How about we standardize large op return outputs instead? He was like, fine, I didn't implement it entirely yet. As people are not actively using the version with fake public key, I can still change to op return if you guys standardize it.
Okay, so he sat down with the guy from Citria, and the guy from Citria said, hey, I'm going to bloat the UTXO set with my spam. And Antoine said, hey, have you finished writing this yet? Because if you use op return, that won't be as bad as it won't be as bad for Bitcoin. And the Citria guy said, yeah, I haven't finished writing it yet, so I can adapt to that if you do it. That's the motivation here. It's negotiating with spammers, aka terrorists, who are promising us that they're going to use Bitcoin for non-monetary purposes. It's that guy, you know, you're going to the store, hey, I'm going to the store, and then 5 of your roommates go, oh, can you get me some eggs? And can you get me a can of Red Bull? And can you get me some broccoli? And they just expect you to go to the store and buy all this stuff for them because you're going anyway. That's what they're doing to people that run nodes. I'm running nodes because I need to be able to use Bitcoin permissionlessly. Okay, can you store this data, please? We're trying to do Ethereum on top of the Bitcoin network. Can you store this? Can you store that? And all the core devs are doing is saying, oh, well, they're going to store it no matter what, and you're going to go and buy all that stuff. Here, I'll give you a bag to carry it all with. That's what they're trying to lessen the harm of it and make it a bit more convenient, but they're never ever standing up to the fundamentally abusive nature of it by saying, we need to figure out a way to counter this stuff. Is it possible? Yeah, it is. It's historically what we've always done and had great success with, because almost everything in the chain adheres to the standardness rules. Why don't we upgrade the standardness rules to thwart these bad actors? Why are we rolling out the red carpet for them and using these lame justifications that, oh, well, at least if they use op return, it will be slightly less harmful than if they bloated the UTXO set? And I'm going to get more into the UTXO set later, because that's the most disingenuous concern of this whole thing, but that's mainly a Matt Corallo being full of shit rather than Antoine. Antoine, again, I do find Antoine to have been much more sincere than some of the other core devs.
In any case, he's going to broadcast stuff through the Bitcoin peer-to-peer relay network. So it's either fake public key data that is forever unspendable output that everyone has to store forever, or it's on up return output. So I emailed mailing lists saying we should just get rid of the stuff.
Again, why are core devs having discussions with Citria and trying to move goalposts around in order to say, hey, well, if we do this, it'll be a bit cheaper for you? Like, why are these kinds of conversations happening? Why is the mailing list's time and energy being taken up by trying to accommodate spammers? And the conversation should be around, there's an attacker that's declaring that they're going to undermine the network. What can we do about this? Why aren't we doing what we've always done? Why aren't we coming up with countermeasures? Why are we just planning on lessening the harm of it and treating it as an inevitability? They're treating it like weather. It just rains sometimes. No, the rain is motivated. It's coming from an entity that has decided they want to do that. And you can come to the entity and disagree with them and say, if you do this, we are going to do that, so do something else. They're treating it just like an inevitability that there's nothing you can do anything about, rather than humans on the other end of it, where we can combat them and say, we're going to come up with countermeasures to what you're doing, and we don't like you being here. Have fun on your next phone call with all your investors who are going to be incredibly nervous about the fact that Bitcoin has demonstrated that it doesn't want us doing what we're doing here. Why aren't we using Ethereum? Why aren't we using Solana? Why are we using Bitcoin, which is hostile to us? Are there legal ramifications for us doing this stuff?
Darkness limits on up return. In one way, Todd was right 2 years ago. This tight policy created incentives to use more harmful ways, and the
only reason those incentives to use fake pub keys instead of op return exist is because the filters work. They are an effective deterrent that is too much. The fact that you can't trivially get around them without paying loads more money is an effect. That's what it means to work, as Matt Hill said.
Unnecessary in the first place, because people that want to store data are using a structure that costs them 4 times less in any case. So we must just as well get rid of this limit and stop creating.
Yeah, so because the inscriptions are so cheap anyway, we might as well just get rid of the limit. Like, this is a complete and utter resignation. There is nothing we can do about this stuff. We're never going to target inscriptions. And op return is better than fake pub key outputs, so just blow out the limit completely. And probably no one will use it because the inscription hack is cheaper. Again, it's just, you can find the rationale for it. I'm not saying they don't have a point. I'm just saying they are completely and utterly incapable of ever showing a backbone and standing up to these people instead.
Purpose incentives for users of the relay network.
The lead sponsor of this show is Bold, the best place to buy, sell, and save Bitcoin. Bitcoin technique and your tribe. The inscription, so it's a bit complicated. So in 2023, that was sort of when we saw this craze known as Ordinals. And associated with Ordinals, there were other things like inscriptions, BRC20, SRC20, etc. Now, Ordinals, the protocol itself relates to kind of the serialization of Satoshis and kind of the first sat in a block or the first sat in a halving or etc., the first sat in a difficulty adjustment, these kinds of things. And then on top of that, there was this inscriptions thing, which relates to things like putting JPEGs in the chain and so on. To be clear, that inscriptions thing uses this thing known as, I guess it's colloquially known as the taproot inscription envelope, and that relates to, as I understand, it's like it's a type of script that's written in a way, it's like op false, op if, and then they push some data, and then that inside of that, there's like this commit and reveal structure, and that is what they're using to put these JPEGs into the chain. This is going into what's known as the witness section of the data, and it never enters the UTXO set. That's one side. That's the inscription aspect of this. On the other side of this, you have this these fake pub keys that are going into the UTXO set, and the downside on that is you cannot prune those. Every node has to download those. We saw this expansion over that time of the UTXO set from about 4 gig to I think maybe 12 gigs, something like this. And every full node on the network, even a pruned node, has to maintain that And so it's kind of an increased requirement on every node runner. Have I summarized it correctly?
Yes, absolutely. And it's very important to point out that there are two different concerns. Proposing to remove the limits on the up return gave an opportunity for people that were discontent with Bitcoin Core's current relay policy to not have tightened them like in 2023 to restart this debate. And it led to the two discussions to be mixed up together.
Well, no, because there isn't a complete contradiction there. When it comes to the moderation policy at the GitHub, that's why a lot of the blow up happened. You don't get to close the inscriptions, the inscription filter PR because it's too controversial, and then ignore all controversy around the op return one. It didn't need to blow up like this, and the reason that it did, you had all these turncoats sitting there saying, "Oh, we had all these moderation policies all this time, and now we're going to start using them." That was just too convenient. I'm sorry, and that's why, it changed from passivity in the face of spammers to active, acquiescence to them, which is just that. But it suddenly takes on a new level of not acceptableness, and obviously the wider context gets discussed. Yeah, I want the inscriptions filter inside Bitcoin Core. I didn't get very far pushing that before, and the community was a lot more resistant to it back then. They're not as resistant now. And you guys also tried blowing out the op return filters 2 years ago, and it got closed. Peter Todd's pull request just got closed without much controversy. Now, suddenly you're pushing it through. The environment's different, and the entire the overarching conversation is around spam. It's all relevant, and we're talking about all of it. The fact that you're prepared to bend over and give them what they want for op returns, or convince them that that's what they should use because it's slightly less harmful to Bitcoin, even though they probably won't even care enough to rewrite their protocol. The fact that you'll do that, we have to contrast it with the fact that you guys weren't prepared to ever entertain any countermeasures to inscriptions, because we need to bring that up, because that, again, is a valid approach. You can counter what Citria does more effectively than just trying to hope that they use a path of slightly less resistance, which also happens to be slightly less harmful to Bitcoin. The invoked reasons for this are just not adding up, and the contradictions between the two positions have to be highlighted. It's not just opportunism. It's genuine highlighting of inconsistent enforcement, the protocol development, what's procedural within Bitcoin Core, and how that's inconsistently enforced, and it's all in service of being more permissive of spam, and anything that tries to move in the opposite direction is blocked for whatever reason, at whatever level. Stupid ideological concerns saying this is censorship, even though it's something we've always done. Obviously, nodes have no incentive to relay this stuff. I'm going to rant more on this in a bit.
Whether we want to remove the limits on op returns, and whether we want to filter, I don't think it's a good term because it's not going to filter anything, but whether we want to tighten.
Of course it is.
Bitcoin cost and honest rules to prevent relaying arbitrary data storage. So these are two different concerns. My proposal is not going to enable anything new with regard to data storage. My proposal is not to accommodate any specific company. It's not to accommodate any specific usage that would be needed for new users. They don't need it. We do. Like we, Bitcoin users, need it for them to use a less harmful way of storing data, but they don't.
Only if we accept your premise that there is nothing we can do to counter it except try and encourage them to use paths of lower resistance, which is false.
And I guess
we do not need this stuff. Bitcoiners do not need op return to be bigger, because Bitcoiners are moving Bitcoins around. They're not creating provably unspendable outputs that are arbitrary data storage that were allowed to spammers as a compromise and as an olive branch. But compromises are not good. Do you want to fly on a compromised airplane? Do you want to drive across a compromised bridge? No, you don't.
I should have asked this a bit earlier as well, because one of the, let's say, upfront obvious questions, because this has become a bit of a meme online, that people are saying Bitcoin Core developers don't see Bitcoin as money. They see it as this database for arbitrary storage. So
that's not Bitcoin Core developers. That's Shinobi.
Just asking the question so you can answer it. Do you view Bitcoin as money, and do most core devs see it that way?
Yeah, I replied online as well. It's like a tautology, right?
Yeah, I'm not saying Bitcoin Core devs don't understand Bitcoin as money. I'm saying they don't understand money. So they apply all the wrong principles to it in the service of trying to make it better, but having the opposite effect. Peter Todd is the best example here, which is he thinks you can screw around with either the 21 million limit or soft forking demurrage or demurrage. I have no idea how you pronounce this, which is basically taxing hodlers to pay for miners. The entire point of Bitcoin is that you get rid of bureaucrats that think they can fiddle around with various numbers within an economic system and reallocate wealth and make something better. The entire point of Bitcoin is getting away from that. You have variables, they are what they are, and they don't change, and deflation is fine, or disinflation, whichever is the correct economic term for whatever Bitcoin is. Moving stuff around and reallocating wealth in order to try and make a system better arbitrarily is Ethereum. That's peak Ethereum, when they said they were ultrasound money because they slashed their issuance rate to lower than that of Bitcoin. And we said, that isn't what makes you sound money. It's not about the issuance rate. It's about whether it can be arbitrarily changed or not and how trivial that is to do. You can't arbitrarily change stuff like the 21 million limit, even though the 21 million limit is itself arbitrary. If it can be changed by a small group of people who think they have a good, brilliant idea about how an economy can perform even better, run a million miles away. That's what I did when I went to Bitcoin in the first place. And the fact that you have core devs with that kind of hubris and ignorance tells you that these people might think Bitcoin's money, but that doesn't mean they know what money is.
Bitcoin as money. Yes, Bitcoin is money. The way it is implemented, because
just because you know C++ doesn't mean you understand decent economic theory.
Even if you say Bitcoin is money, probably you're talking about the asset.
Yeah, all right. Bitcoin is money, and Bitcoin is the network on which the money moves around. That is a point I've been trying to drive home.
That is enabled by a network, and this network, physically, it contains data. And people are always going to try to use the data for other things. One interesting example is the ordinals that you mentioned earlier. They just change the meaning without storing any data on the chain, change the meaning of the asset. This set is worth more than this set. You just cannot prevent this. But yes, I do see Bitcoin as money, obviously.
Yeah, you can't prevent systems of interpretation that get superimposed onto Bitcoin. This is what KYC is. It's never a good thing when it happens, and there's very little you can do to fight it. But I don't understand at all what the relevance is to whether we filter spam or not. Spam and KYC and chain analysis like ordinals are just another topic completely. There's nothing to do with this conversation.
All Bitcoin core developers see Bitcoin as money, and then I think there is maybe different perspectives on how bad people storing data on chain is. I think some people view it as pretty inevitable. Some people see it as at least someone is using the chain, and maybe we'll get some money for miners once we don't have subsidy anymore. And
miners getting money isn't naturally a good thing for Bitcoin. Introducing economic externalities like people storing stuff on the chain that's nothing to do with Bitcoin only adds volatility to an already overly volatile system already. The price is already hectic enough. You don't need the fee market to get hectic too. You don't need miners suddenly earning way more, a bunch more people turning on, and then that fad dying, and then the fee market dying again, but with a much higher difficulty, and then waiting for it to commensurately drop again. Don't introduce the extra. Miners don't need to be earning money from anything that isn't Bitcoin because they are our security guards. And if they are paid by someone that isn't us, the extent to which they can earn money with these side gigs is the extent to which they don't answer to us. We need them earning every single penny they earn from Bitcoin itself, not from side gigs, not from governments giving them tax breaks, not from stuff like the Canadian government giving you 50% off your taxes if you agree not to make your own templates, which is how it works and why they all have to use Foundry and why they need Foundry to make their templates for them and take custody of everything that comes out the chain. Because then they don't have to pay sales tax because they're not there's some criteria that they no longer fit that means they have to charge sales tax. But that's not a good incentive, right? Miners making more money or at least paying less tax if they do stuff that's bad for Bitcoin isn't just, that's great, a miner made more money. You can't ignore it. The only money they need to be making is from us doing actual transactions, and for a while it's going to be subsidy too. And even that has its problems. You only want miners making money from Bitcoiners transacting in the long run. Because if they earn money from anything else, then they're going to please that employer over the Bitcoiners themselves that need them to protect the network. And then you're done.
Some people are really discontent about people actively using the chain to store data.
Yeah, because it's not what it's for, and it undermines the entire network. It goes against the reason anyone would run a node, and if you do that, if you lessen people's incentive to run nodes, you turn us more and more into a regular old cryptocurrency.
And wish it would go away.
I wish it would go away, and I know how to make it go away, but you guys keep pretending we can't do anything about it when we so trivially can.
But realize that trying to act upon it at the relay policy layer is going to make things worse.
So here we get into the arguments, the trade-offs. Apparently, if we filter, bad things are going to happen. It's not just that they don't work and the arbitrary data will still get in the chain. It's that when that happens, we will suffer as a result. So let's see which ones are the reasons he does, whether it's your fee estimation will suck, or that will cause mining centralization, or it will bloat the UTXO set because they're going to use that as the more harmful method.
So yeah, everyone sees Bitcoin as money. That's why we are all interested in Bitcoin. That's where we are spending our career improving Bitcoin and spending all our days, for some of us, our weekends, trying to make Bitcoin better. So it's really a misperception of core devs as being, I don't know, nerds that don't even care about Bitcoin ideologically. I think that's very, very different.
It's somewhat accurate. Nerd isn't really an insult, is it? But the point is, again, just because you know C++ doesn't mean you know economics, or that we're going to be aligned with our political outlook on the world. I mean, I don't know what to say about that. Like, you can be incredibly clever in one domain and completely clueless in another.
Most people I can think of right now on the top of my head care deeply about Bitcoin and Bitcoin mission.
So let's go back to
You might care, and the caring might be sincere. That doesn't mean you're not capable of harming it with misunderstanding it.
this narrow op return PR, and just ask a few questions around that. So I think some of the discussion in that thread was sort of saying, why uncap it instead of going up to, I don't know, 150 bytes or so? Was it seen like that would be an arbitrary decision? Because
then it would obviously just be about this one use case that for this particular product where Antoine sat down and chatted with the guy and proposed moving the goalpost in Bitcoin around to satisfy them. I've always contended that the reason they want to blow it out completely and say it's just utterly useless and invoke all these much higher level reasons and use all these broad stroke arguments is because it can't look so obvious. They can't be moving stuff around for a specific use case that is a spammer.
Some people are saying, why raise it all the way now to, I think it was 100 kilobytes is now the theoretical limit. Can you explain your perspective on that?
Yes. So I think 150 would be just enough for Citria, but I'm not really concerned about Citria's use case. I don't know if I define Citria as basically the users that I met that are saying that they're going to use the fake public keys. So
gotcha.
The user I met that promised they were going to do harm to Bitcoin, that we are now scrambling to try and give them a slightly nicer method.
The immediate concern of these guys would be covered by increasing the limit to 150 bytes. But their usage is going to be very, very limited. It's some sort of challenge transactions in the unhappy path for using their protocol. So these transactions that is going to blow the UTXO set should never happen on chain in normal conditions. So probably we would see, I don't know, a few per year.
Yeah, it's rare. It's like the justice transactions in Lightning. It's in normal cases, it just never really happens.
But what I'm really concerned about is that it's a signal. It's a signal to Bitcoin Core that there are users of Bitcoin that
these are attackers, not users,
want to use the chain differently, and because they want to use the Bitcoin Core relay network, you are pushing them to use more harmful ways of doing what they're trying to do. So I think it's a strong signal to act upon. And so,
well, why don't you take that signal to mean that they want to use the P2P layer? So we use the P2P layer to prevent them from doing this stuff, rather than we modify it to make them do it in another way. You can go either way with that argument. And again, the one that requires a backbone is just not even on the table here.
I'm more worried about future use cases. Therefore, just limiting it to 150 bytes is just trying to patch it in a rush. Whereas I think we should be more concerned about what's going to be the next application.
We need to play reverse whack-a-mole. We need to anticipate future spammers like Citria that might want 180 bytes.
The developers of the next application going to be as willing to engage with us as Citria has been, because me asking them to use up return instead is just, that's up to them. They don't care. They have no incentive to use up returns instead. So maybe the next ones won't be willing to change. So I want to have a limit that is future proof, let's say. So maybe you could say raising it to 1,000, 1 kilobytes would be enough.
The only tool in this guy's box is op return. Spam is going to happen, that is a given, and there's nothing you can do to reduce it, let alone counter it completely. And op return is our favorite way of them doing it. So let's give them infinity freaking op return, because that is the solution to spam. It will always happen. There is nothing we could ever do to counter it. Filters don't work, but we need to get rid of the op return filter, because if they use as much op return as they could ever want, as opposed to any other method, it just won't be quite as bad. Like this, am I characterizing it correctly? Do you understand that while that is technically defensible, it is completely gutless, and it's also in denial of all of history before 2023? We did this absolutely fine. New spammer in town? All right, we're going to start filtering your stuff. You don't get to use the P2P layer anymore. And now you have the choice. You can start bloating the UTXO set, or you can adapt and do something we don't hate, or you can use another crypto. And you can start bloating the UTXO set, and we will still start filtering your stuff. Just like I said, we can even though Citria at the moment is designed to bloat the UTXO set, we can still filter it, just not by analyzing the outputs they create, because we know their methods. Luke DM'd the guy from Citria and said, hey, can you give me the following info? And they did, thinking he was just curious about how their product worked. And then he wrote a spam filter that would break their product. This is the kind of idiots you're dealing with, and the naivety in which they wander into the space, because most of them, people like Marapool with Slipstream, they think they're doing something good. They think they're circumventing the censorship imposed on them by the network of the people that run the nodes, who are actually what makes Bitcoin what it is. They think getting around those people is virtuous.
And I think it would be pretty hard to make the case to bump it all the way back from 1K to 100K on the basis of this argument of future usages. But on the other hand, it's just an unnecessary limit that we have in Bitcoin Core that is an artifact of more than a decade ago, a limit being introduced back when blocks were not full.
No, it's just an arbitrary limit. We can get rid of it. The big blockers said the same thing. 1 megabyte was only meant to do X, Y, Z. Satoshi's gone. Computers are faster now. The internet's faster. Hard drives are cheaper. Same nonsense argument. It's just an arbitrary number. We're crippling Bitcoin. We need to open it up to these use cases. We're not even calling them attackers anymore.
Back when Bitcoin Core was even more dominant. And if Bitcoin Core hadn't been...
It wasn't. NOTS was actually a lot more dominant back then. Core is basically as dominant as it has ever been, save for the last 3 weeks where a bunch of people have switched over to NOTS.
Dominance in the past decade, it would just not be a discussion anymore. These transactions would be relayed and mined. So I think it makes no sense for us to just keep on maintaining this limits. Having these codes is unnecessary, and it's just a good excuse to finally get rid of unnecessary code.
Okay, and so
it's only unnecessary if you've agreed that there is absolutely nothing we can do to limit spam, and we just have to roll out the red carpet.
This op return issue, how urgent do you believe it is to fix this issue? Is it a must fix now? Is it a medium term thing? Is it more like a long term thing that has to be fixed for the incentives of the network to try to stave off miner centralization? How urgent is this for you?
The miner centralization concerns are separate. They are for the inscription filtering thing. Like for the up return, in any case, for the up return, it's transactions that would be already standard. So there would be no incentive for them to be using private bridges to miners. So this is a big topic that is probably more interesting than the size of fucking up returns, but that's a separate concern. For the urgency to fix, it's hard to say. If we only consider Citria, it's not that urgent. But also, we need to consider...
Dude, it is irrelevant. The amount of if we did nothing here and Citria just bloated the UTXO set by 1 kilobyte a year, who cares? We bloated it by 8 gigabytes in the last 2 years. It's not even it's not a drop in the ocean. There's no urgency to do any of this stuff. The threat is so minimal that they're just taking it and running with it. Well, there's going to be other Citrias. We need to open up op return as soon as possible, so they design their protocols in a way that uses op return. and we don't have to ask them to modify anything because we might change it once we discover their intentions. Let's do it in anticipation of future Citrias.
It's a signal. It's a piece of information that, hey, you're creating perverse incentives, which should make us pause. We should make, like, creating perverse incentives pretty bad in our case. And I think we should act quick to make sure that new applications do not build on top of the technique that is used by Citria that is harmful. Because I'm convinced that new applications...
The amount of harm it does is almost zero. What it does to the UTXO set is basically zero. The harm it does is social. It's institutionally decaying. That's the problem. It's because you have core developers spending their time, wasting everyone's time on the mailing list, sacrificing their own reputation, bending over backwards for them. That is the harm it does to Bitcoin. It undermines trust. It meant that 9% of the network moved off of Bitcoin Core because of how they were being perceived. That's harmful because and the conferences are filled up with scammers and pictures of Pepe the Frog everywhere at formerly respected institutions like Bitcoin Magazine. That's a problem. It's got nothing to do with Bitcoin, but it is a massive indication of cultural decay. And you can't just turn a blind eye to that and just be like, well, if we make Operaturn a bit bigger, it's going to mean they don't use fake pub keys and that's better, or maybe they will. Like, it's the naivety here and the failure to recognize the context is just so, it's blind. It's absolutely blind.
Applications, once they're built, you're going to have a very hard time to ask them to go back, re-implement their constructions, convince their users to switch back to the new version of the protocol, just to be nice. I feel like...
And to save a tiny little bit of money.
People can do things just to be nice, but if they're not financially motivated, there is only so much that they're going to do to help you.
I see. And so I guess the concern, I can see kind of both sides there. On one side of it, you can see every now and again there's like some new meta protocol that comes out, and maybe that's part of the broader kind of spam filter discussion where, you know, there might be some Chinese new meta protocol, and maybe kind of, you know, Bitcoin core developers are not really in touch with them per se, and they might just come out with some new meta protocol, and then we're all just dealing with them kind of in the mempool and doing whatever. But I guess others would see that, and others would say, I guess it's kind of the censorship resistance maxis might sort of take the view of, I guess we're kind of going more into the broader filtering discussion. So one other area I want to get into, just on this Operaturn specific point before we go to the kind of the broader conversation. Some people are saying, why not give people the option? Why not let the node user have a config or a command line option to choose what they want to relay? Because there was a concern that this would potentially get deprecated. And so there was some discussion there saying, okay, well, deprecated just means it still exists now, but it's probably going to get deleted in the next...
This was so stupid. What a stupid thing for Gloria to end up nuking her account over.
Version. So that was the concern. What's your view on giving people an option or a flag to choose their own relay policy, let's say?
So he's asking him, why not let users have their own filters, even if they're nothing to do with what Core sets as a default? Now, please keep in mind, we've basically already conceded in this, and Antoine has agreed that Bitcoin Core is basically just Bitcoin. And I think he's going to double down on that now.
Personal view is that the option is unnecessary, and that if we are going to change the default, then we need to, we don't need to do anything, but we should remove the option. It appears to not be consensual among contributors to the project, which is another thing. Like, Bitcoin Core is not one mind thinking alike on all issues. People have different views. I'm not going to die on this hill, but I personally think we should get rid of the option. Before making the point of why I believe we should get rid of it, let me state that in any case, it's an objection to the implementation of the change, and it's not an objection to changing the default per se.
He's right. It's different. If they blow out the default and leave configurability, that is a separate topic from if they blow out the default and deny us the configurability.
And as for why I believe we should remove the option is that once, let's face it, once Bitcoin Core changes the default, it's going to become the de facto policy on the network.
There you go. Because Bitcoin Core is basically just Bitcoin. So if you change the default to something ridiculous and you leave configurability as part of a negotiation tactic, you get to then turn around and say, well, a couple of guys decided to configure it back to the old 80 bytes, and it isn't really doing anything, and it's just serving as technical debt. So we're going to release we're going to remove the configurability from Bitcoin Core. We told you filters don't work; they don't do anything. Do you understand what they're doing here? And I love that he said this because it completely contradicts earlier. Hey, Bitcoin Core is not Bitcoin. They're trying to make that position hold, and it just doesn't. And we get nowhere pretending that if Bitcoin Core sets a default and sensible spam filtration limit, that spam is not getting around the network anymore by virtue of the fact that almost everyone just runs Bitcoin Core and everyone uses defaults. And he's just admitted that here. And that's such a practical thing to admit and for us to leverage in order for the network to defend itself against spammers.
And if it becomes the de facto policy on the network, one local node changing his own option is not going to have any effects whatsoever globally. So the only reason one may want to change the option is for maybe some sort of local use case. So let's consider what can be a local use case. Well, I don't
want to participate in relaying this crap. So the justification is always there, even if they say it's completely ineffective having aggressive spam filtration policies and you're the only guy on the network doing it. It's like, so what? I still don't want to participate in relaying this stuff around. And then he has to come back to all of the ways in which I'm shooting myself in the foot by doing it, which are all nonsense.
I want to be storing op return data in my mempool. Sure, but if you don't have it in your mempool, you're going to store it anyways because it's going to arrive in a block.
Bad thing will happen, so might as well facilitate bad thing happening.
But in addition, not having it in your mempool is going to be a foot gun for you if you're using Bitcoin to transact, because then you're going to blind yourself to some transactions that you're competing for block space with. And
you never know whether the miner is running the filter too. They never talk about the flip side of this, which is if there's a miner on the network whose filters resemble yours somewhat, you don't overpay by mistake. And fixing overpayment is a lot harder than fixing underpayment. If you don't pay enough, you RBF the transaction and bump it up. If you overpay, it's much more of a hassle to undo that. And if you don't run filters, you're more likely to overpay. Nonetheless, none of this applies to Bitcoin Core anyway. That's not how fee estimation works in Bitcoin Core. I agree that objectively your fee estimation is going to get a bit worse if you run aggressive filters that no one else on the network is running. Fair enough. But fee estimation is basically useless anyway. It's impossible unless we all just move towards this ridiculous world where everyone has to have identical mempools and every single miner has to just use what's in that mempool. And if they don't, it's censorship. This is the kind of world that people are naively building. The reality is miners can put whatever they like in blocks, and you have no idea when the next block is coming, or who is going to mine it, or what mood the miner was in when they did it. The fact that everything appears so uniform and predictable at the moment is an artifact of centralization. It's not sustainable. Mining has to become decentralized again, and then fee estimation can't really progress from the heuristic of when did these things show up in my mempool, and how long did it take for them to get in the blockchain? And you look back and you calculate based on that. Because you can't know any more with any more certainty than that. You can estimate a fee based on that, even though you had a bunch of transactions filtered that didn't tell you, oh, wait a minute, you should probably pay a bit more. But the next block wasn't for 4 hours anyway, or whatever, how long it takes. Okay, we've never had that long between blocks, but you get my point. Fee estimation means knowing the future. That's not possible. So it's all based on heuristics, and yes, they get a little bit worse if you don't have the same mempool as everyone else. But Bitcoin does not require us all to have the same mempools, not for anything. It does degrade certain things if we don't have the efficiency of having one centralized homogeneous mempool. Yeah, we can build heuristics based on that, but it's just an artifact of centralization, of mempool policy, and of mining. None of those things are acceptable, and we have to get rid of those things, and Bitcoin just needs to be able to work if we don't have that. So this foot gun is bullshit.
If you are a miner, even more importantly, or you are going to make block propagation to you slower.
No, you're not. And this is where the technical side of the argument actually doesn't know what they're talking about on a technical level. If you see transactions that you don't want to relay around the network and you're a miner and you filter them, you are going to cache them. This is called, I think it's called block reconstruction extra TXN or something. I can't remember the name of it exactly, But what it means is that when you get the compact block from a miner that does include the shit you filtered, you can reconstruct it just as fast as everyone that didn't filter. It does not harm miners to filter spam at all. It doesn't slow down what they're doing. If everyone starts doing it and you never see it and it's not cached, sure, then it starts getting slower for you to process the block. But that's the miner's problem that found that block, not yours, in any sort of scenario where mining actually starts to become decentralized again. I'm sure this is going to come up more in this.
And therefore...
But the fact that core devs don't seem to know this thing exists and most miners don't is ridiculous to me. It was immediately a thing with Ocean, where people were like, wait, if you're filtering out some transactions, isn't it slower for you to verify? Immediate response, no, because we still know about the transactions. They're still being passed around the network and we cache everything. So we can validate your compact block as quick as a pool that doesn't filter it. The fact that these guys don't know about this stuff is embarrassing. And given that they keep coming at me and saying, oh, Mechanic's making all these technical mistakes, I've owned my technical mistakes. And if I'm making more of them, I'll happily go on Twitter and say, I got this wrong, I got that wrong. But these guys need to stop pretending that it's slower to verify compact blocks if you filter, because caching exists, and that's how any miner would do it. Miners need to know about the contents of any potential block. They need to find out about all transactions possible. If the network at large is filtering, it's not incumbent on them to stop doing that just to help you out as a tiny miner.
Marginally reduce your effective hash rate. I don't think these are strong options to strong reasons to not have the option at all. But there's definitely no good reason, no valid reason to have the option. Because there is no reason to have the option.
Because I don't want to relay this junk around the network. That's why.
Because having an option imposes a cost on the project.
No, it doesn't. There is no cost to me filtering spam. All it does is make life a tiny little bit harder for the spammer. And the more people that feel the way I do, the more hard they get hit with it and the more they have to start redesigning stuff and dealing with their nervous investors about the fact that this network seems to hate us.
And on users, Bitcoin Core has 150 startup options at this time. It's crazy. I don't think we should have an option that has no to mildly negative effect on the user.
He says it's mildly negative. It's not. It's a positive effect. The negative effect, the only one I'll concede, is that it might make fee estimation a bit worse. And fee estimation requires knowing the future anyway, which you don't. It's never going to be an exact science. You start out as low as you think you might need to be. If you don't pay enough because there's a wave of inscriptions making their way into blocks and you don't know anything about it because you filter out of your mempool, you just bump your fee. That's all.
And it's something that we just do normally as well.
And remember, you could be paying less because if Ocean finds a block that doesn't include inscriptions, then you get in and you didn't unnecessarily overpay. So how is that just so unequivocally ineffective or slightly bad for people that run these things? He's completely ignoring certain elements here. Your fee estimation can improve if you start filtering spam, and there's any miner on the network that also filters spam, and there's demonstrably a bunch of those because of Ocean, and we find a block a day. So, I mean, that's not enough for it to be a major factor here, but it's real, and he's ignoring all of the positives, which is I don't want to participate in relaying this crap around the network. That is something I don't want to be forced to do by the software you guys are making, and I want the decision to opt out of that.
We don't have options that are going to have a negative effect on the user, and we do not have options that are going to have no change whatsoever.
Yeah, so the rationale is this option will hurt users, so we need to get rid of it, even though it won't hurt users, and users have a very good reason for wanting this thing. So it's a false assertion, but the deletion is based on the premise. The removal of that thing, or just deprecating that thing, is based on the premise that this can only hurt users or do nothing, so we're going to get rid of it. And that's false. I've just explained why that's false. He's missing out whole chunks of the story. We all filter. Every node on the network currently filters. And if I want to have more accurate fee estimation, the more I filter in line with what the rest of the miners are doing, the more accurate my fee estimation gets. And are my blocks slowed down by the network only if I'm putting junk in them that they don't recognize and they've never seen? It's Mara's problem if their blocks they find that are full of trash go around the network more slowly because people are unfamiliar with all of the transactions in them. They're not cached. They never heard of these. They only got submitted directly to Slipstream. That's Mara's problem. And if Mara want to make that the problem of small miners by bullying the network, by broadcasting blocks full of unknown crap, and then taking advantage of the fact that they get a head start in the next race, that only becomes significant if they're a big enough miner that they can bully the rest of the network. If we start filtering en masse and Foundry come up with a method like Slipstream where they start soliciting out-of-band stuff that the Bitcoin nodes have never heard of, they're in a great position because they broadcast the block. The rest of the network goes, what the heck is this? And it takes them maybe 50 milliseconds longer to verify the block. Okay, so Foundry get a 50 millisecond head start on a 10-minute race that happens 1/3 of 144 times a day because there are 144 blocks and Foundry's roughly 1/3 of the network. That's pretty amazing for Foundry, right? Foundry, they can bully the rest of the network that will have worse mining centralization, which is his point here. But the point is, if they have the amount of hash rate where they can actually use this as an attack, they can already 51% attack the network. They are too big. Bitcoin mining is centralized. And what Core are trying to do is optimize for that and treat it as a permanent reality. Again, more cowardice. There's no such thing as Ocean. There's no such thing as Datum. Maybe Stratum v2 exists, even though it's junk. We'll pretend that that's a potential solution to mining centralization. They will never acknowledge the real effort being made to actually make it so that the thousands of miners on Foundry are all individual nodes that are making their own templates, in which case this attack no longer works. If one of those miners puts a bunch of junk in one of their blocks and relays it around the network, it hurts them, not the rest of the network, because the rest of the network is like, what the heck is this block? It contains a bunch of stuff I've never heard of. Oh, look, here was another block found by a different miner at the same time who respected the network, who respected the nodes, and filled his block up with familiar transactions. That one gets processed faster than the one full of junk. The one full of junk just got orphaned. That miner got punished for putting spam in there, which means they need to charge way more to justify doing it. Losing 99% of what you could in a block in the shape of subsidy, which is most of what miners' income is, it's not worth risking that to add a tiny little bit extra to the remaining 1% that could be spam instead of legitimate transactions. This is not worth it. Bitcoin has a very good mechanism here for telling miners that want to abuse the network by violating standardness, not just consensus, that they are taking a gamble and that they probably shouldn't do it. And this is what Bitcoin Core used to say. Back in 2016, what was the related pull request? Oh, it was compact blocks itself. When that was proposed and merged into Bitcoin Core, the advice was, hey, miners, update your spam filters because if you don't, your blocks will propagate more slowly. It wasn't, hey, nodes, relay as much trash around the network as possible, otherwise mining will get more centralized because the biggest miners will attack the network deliberately by broadcasting blocks that they know get processed more slowly. This is complete. They can do that attack regardless of how permissive we are of spam. If we become completely and utterly just bent over, lying down, with our face burying our head in the sand and saying, we will relay as much trash as possible, a miner with 30% of the network can destroy everything if they want to anyway. That's just, it gives them one more tool to do it that isn't even the best way to do that specific category of attack. Foundry could also just not tell the network about their block for a minute if they want. They could just do that, even if it's filled with completely standard transactions. They can do that. And the fact that they would win doing that versus how Bitcoin typically works, where we expect miners to want the network to know about it as quickly as possible, is only because they're so big. And the fact that they're so big undermines everything because it means you basically have to trust them with the integrity of the network. That doesn't work. Bitcoin doesn't work if mining is centralized. Relaying more trash around the network to try and curb the tide there is not a real solution to that problem. And these people are clowns for pretending this is an actual thing. They are not concerned about mining centralization at all. And this being invoked as a concern in the context of spam filtration is disingenuous.
For the user. So I think we should remove it. But it's also, I'm not going to die on this hill. Currently what Bitcoin Core is going for, well, I did not open the pull request. Someone else opened the new pull request, and it seems that most Bitcoin Core contributors act this pull request, and this new pull request does not get rid of the option. It does mark it as deprecated, as you mentioned. We'll see how it goes. Last time we marked an option as deprecated, we removed it. It was for mempool for RBF. But sometimes we mark stuff as deprecated and we never come around to removing it. But it doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter because the option does effectively nothing for the user.
Yeah, he's saying the option does nothing. It does loads. I don't want to relay trash around the network, and I'm unconvinced by your arguments that me refusing to do that centralizes mining or makes my fee estimation bad. These are not real, sincere arguments, and this is the weakest part of their whole position.
Okay. And so you mentioned mempool full RBF. Now, this is perhaps there's some parallels here that it's sort of this, even though it was kind of changed at Bitcoin Core. It's kind of like this emergent behavior on the network that if enough users do this thing, have full RBF, then the network effectively just operates that way, partially because Bitcoin Core was so dominant, but also just kind of the incentive of it. And so I guess in a way, I'm sort of seeing this as a similar thing, that it's probably going to end up going in a similar way. But what do you think? Do you agree or disagree, or do you see parallels or no?
I agree. I definitely see parallels, both in accusations around it to Bitcoin Core trying to change things, and about pseudo motivations. Although it's become worse with the filter people, and I see parallels as well in terms of technical reality. If you want to make a change to prevent some transactions to access the miners, you're going to need basically consensus. You're going to need everyone to agree, everyone to make this
Basically, consensus is not consensus.
change, everyone to turn it on. And if you want to make...
Which they will, because as you've already conceded, Bitcoin Core is dominant. It is Bitcoin, and everyone just uses the defaults. It works. And you already talked about leveraging that when for the purposes of upgrade hooks.
You could transactions, you just need one person to relay these transactions that others do not want to make.
Right, that's censorship resistance. That's not spam filtration. If someone is trying to censor Bitcoin transactions and they can get 99% of the network to do it, the censorship fails because one guy still mines it. In fact, the guy that wants to include the transaction in the blockchain can mine it himself. And according to the way that game theory of the networks establishes itself, that means that other miners are going to be incentivized to just mine on top of that block. That's the truth of it. And that's where Bitcoin censorship resistance comes from. It doesn't come from making nodes relay trash they don't want to relay. That's not what makes Bitcoin censorship resistant. It's not forcing me to relay stuff. How deluded are these people?
And which is kind of the purpose, kind of the purpose of Bitcoin. But
the purpose of Bitcoin is not making people relay messages they don't want to relay. It's the fact that you can't rewrite the blockchain after the fact, and the fact that you're incentivized economically to participate in the longest, most valid proof of work chain. And you don't want to sit there saying, oh, this had a bad transaction spent in it, so I'm not going to build on top of this block. I'm going to try and rewrite that block, and then I'm going to fall behind in the race, and I'm going to burn electricity for nothing. That's what censorship resistance is in Bitcoin. It's got nothing to do with forcing nodes to do stuff they don't have any incentive to do.
Yes, you just need one path to miners. You just need some percentage of the hash rates to, or some percentage of the relay network, or just an alternative relay network for the transaction that other people don't want you to make to be made. Therefore, it was the same with full RBF. The transaction in this case that people didn't want you to make is a replacement of a transaction that did not explicitly signal it was up for replacement. And in our case, it would be some sort of very large up return, but nobody asks for large up returns today. It's just useful.
I was ambivalent on losing the config option there. So that makes me a hypocrite, because I have been saying people should have control over their mempools and there's no harm in them doing it. I stand by that. But I also thought the default, making mempool full RBF on by default, was absolutely fine to do, because it makes Bitcoin way better as money. All it does is mean that people don't overestimate what they need to pay for a transaction fee, because RBF doesn't work as well as it might. So turning that on meant you could lowball your fee estimate, and if you just weren't making it into blocks, you could bump it more easily, even if you forgot to set the flag, right? So turning that off by default and removing the config option, I'm still not okay with them removing the config option. But so I think I'm consistent there. But I just didn't really care about it because to the same extent, I wasn't paying. It had nothing to do with spam, and I like RBF. I think it's a good thing to have, and I think having it on by default is sensible. There are people that are telling me they're not okay with it being removed by default, and I ignored those concerns at the time, and I was wrong to do it, because now I'm looking at it and I'm seeing the hypocrisy in my position and knowing that I shouldn't have been okay with it. I was really annoyed with people like John Carvalho that had built their businesses around the assumption that you can trust unconfirmed transactions and treat block zero confirmations as just a bit worse than one confirmation. And we were saying, no, you absolutely cannot do that. I can double spend you at will, and you trying to make it so that my fee estimation gets worse. Funny how the arguments all flip in this context. You trying to make it so that I can't use RBF as easily in order to protect your stupid business, which pretends zero confirmation is a thing. That's not my problem. We're turning on full RBF, and you guys can learn to wait around for confirmations in blocks before you treat transactions as final. That's the whole point of the blockchain. And if you want to start developing heuristics around how confirmed really is a transaction when it's not in the blockchain yet, that tends towards centralization, and that's not a good thing. We don't want everyone subscribing to some sort of walled garden wallet software that refuses to let users spend the same UTXO twice in order to try and double spend someone in order to provide this surrogate protection for what the blockchain is supposed to do and what the blockchain actually does. We don't need a fake blockchain that is a private company telling us that Alice has already paid Bob, so Alice can't pay Charlie. That's just undermining to Bitcoin on so many levels. Don't do it. It's what Bcash tried to do when they were trying to say, look, Lightning's not a thing. You could trust zero confirmation transactions, i.e. unconfirmed transactions. No, you can't, because they're not confirmed. That's not how Bitcoin works.
But yeah, I see parallels. I agree.
All right, so
he sees parallels. So do I, and it basically got me to think about my position a bit more. I hope I clarified it there.
let's now talk about so we've kind of spoken about the specific op return pull requests, or there were multiple, but the one you mentioned that's still open is InstaGib's. Greg Sanders' one is still the open one. Peter Todd's one was closed, as I see it. And so now if we talk about the broader, I guess, spam and filtering conversation, there have been various arguments made, accusations, etc. So I guess we should deal with some of those, or at least hear your perspective on some of those. So, for example, people like Mechanic have made this argument that, there's this apparent double standard, that core people are trying to argue on one hand that filters don't work, but on the other hand that filters do work. Which one is it?
Well, the current position is they've said filters don't work, and now they're trying to add nuance, which is, yeah, they work, but they only hurt the users, and they cause centralization of mining. And that, like I said, is the weakest part of their whole position.
And is that just some kind of rhetorical move, or is that ignoring a nuance? What's your view on this question of do filters work?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good rhetorical move. I don't want to ascribe intentions to Mechanic for doing it, but I think it's absolutely false. But it was very effective in swaying some people to his side. It's mixing up two things as being the same thing and saying that, we are contradicting ourselves. It is not the case. In the case of the up return, what Citria wants to do is to use the public relay network because they want the properties brought by the public relay network.
And the reason they can't is because filters work.
Therefore, they need a way to make their data work through this public relay network. So that's, in this sense, the standardness rules work because they are using something that is defined by the standardness rules. So in this case, they just go to use fake public key data instead. But where Bitcoin Core doesn't say anything. I say things. Where I can say that filters do not work is that in preventing people from using Bitcoin to store data, because what defines Bitcoin is its consensus rules. And trying to change Bitcoin Core to prevent Bitcoin users from using Bitcoin in a specific way is not going to prevent the Bitcoin user from using it how they want. It's just...
Yeah, okay, so it's the initial straw man fallacy. No one says prevention. I mean, I don't know what the technical definition of prevention is, but Antoine is using it to mean complete prevention, 100% effectiveness. No one in our campus ever said that. That is always people against us that like to point out the nirvana, that like to commit the nirvana fallacy, which is you can't entirely stop it from happening, which means it's pointless to prevent it at all. It's pointless to ever counter it. Even if 20% of blocks don't have inscriptions in them, instead of 0%, that's meaningless. You need to stop it completely, otherwise this is a waste of time. And this was always a fool's errand. We never said filters work, and core. He's saying core's pushback was fundamentally that you can't stop arbitrary data storage on Bitcoin. Filters don't work for that. And we're saying, no, we agree, but you can reduce it with filters. And the reason you can reduce it with filters is demonstrated by the fact that you are now having to get rid of a filter that is preventing people from storing arbitrary data using one particular method. Sure, they'd go and use it another way that you're saying is more harmful, but there are filters for that as well. The filters do provide resistance. That's all they can do. They don't completely effectively prevent it. If you want to start doing stuff more hardcore like that, that's a different conversation. But filters add barriers to people that want... They provide inconveniences and act as barriers to people that want to store arbitrary data in Bitcoin. That's a fact. And it's not a rhetorical technique for me to point out that, one, their approach with op return highlights and verifies our claims around what would have happened with inscriptions if you'd started filtering them. This is not. He says he doesn't want to project intentions onto me, and they're both specifically talking about me in arguments I've made here. But it's not a rhetorical technique. They literally are contradicting one another. They only don't contradict if these guys engage in the rhetorical technique of saying that we are making a claim we are not. We are making the claim that spam filters can effectively prevent all arbitrary data in Bitcoin. We've never made that claim. And again, this is a straw man they're knocking over. We're saying it can reduce it. And they are turning around and saying we need to get rid of the filters on op return because they are reducing the amount of people using giant op returns. These are congruent claims, and they both point to the same fundamental logic, which is that filters provide some meaningful resistance to spammers. That is why I'm saying these positions contradict each other, because in one case you're saying they don't do anything, and in the other case you're saying they're doing the thing we say they can't do, so we need to get rid of it because it's harmful and causing UTXO bloat. That's not rhetorical. That is genuine.
It's going to prevent Bitcoin Core from having adoption. People just not going to use Bitcoin Core anymore. They're just going to use a separate implementation or direct way to contact people to get their transactions mined.
That's a very interesting point. So he's saying if we put these barriers inside Bitcoin Core and ignore these signals that he keeps invoking, that users want to use Bitcoin, not attackers, but users want to use it for purposes Bitcoin Core prevents, then people will just start using other stuff. Again, historical precedent. What do we see? The only time I've seen migration away from Bitcoin Core ever has been migration to Bitcoin Knots. Back when miners needed stuff that actually worked, which was years ago, back in early Eligius days. And then Jason had, he knew everyone that ran all the other pools, and they all ran Bitcoin Knots. So most of those blocks back in the day, I don't know if you're looking at block 200,000 around that era, it was all Knots making those templates. It wasn't Core. And now, where you suddenly have 2% of the network running Knots jump up to 9%. We're almost at 10% today. The reason those people are migrating is not because Core is too restrictive with its filtration policies. They're migrating for the exact opposite reason. They're migrating because it's not restrictive enough, and people want the ability to counter spam and not relay it around involuntarily.
So it does not work at preventing people from using the chain as they want. It does prevent people from using the standard.
No, because it can't prevent it. It can only limit it.
Public relay network, because that's how it's defined.
This is just such a fundamental mistake. Spam cannot be entirely prevented. You just make it more annoying for the spammer. That's the only technique that's ever worked.
Okay, so your answer is they can work in certain contexts, but in this context, it's not an applicable argument. Is that?
No,
how does it work?
I don't think it's a good reply because it works in some contexts and not in others with be too vague. It works for.
It just works. It just makes, if you have more spam filters, there is just less spam. It's a correlation.
The public standard transactions relay, because like standardness rules work for the public standard relay, consensus rules work for Bitcoin blocks.
What goes into blocks?
And so saying that standardness rules are going to prevent data from entering blocks is incorrect. Saying that standardness rules are going to prevent data from entering the standard public relay is correct. Although, to their credit, the argument that they're making is that changing the standard public relay network is going to affect how people use the blockchain. But maybe it's going to be another question.
Gotcha. Okay. And so another point of discussion, maybe it's a broader point or maybe it's a specific op return thing, but people are saying there have not been very many non-standard op returns in the last few months. Therefore, you're kind of making a big deal to change this big PR when really it's not really going to be used that much.
Yeah.
No, Stephan. Stephan shoots and he misses. The fact that there haven't been many of these giant op returns is because we haven't built the road for the traffic yet. When we nuke these limits, there will suddenly be loads of giant op returns all the time. That's what they're doing here. Stephan's saying, does that really justify opening it up? Because I don't see traffic on the road that doesn't exist yet. I don't understand why he would ask something that ridiculous.
It's not about changing non-standard op returns, so that's besides the point. And I'm not making a big deal. And I think it's a pretty boring change, and people are making a big deal out of it.
And now another argument I've heard is from the filter camp. They might say things like, okay, look, yeah, the core developers are saying these concerns about UTXO bloat, minor centralization, block propagation, these are technically real, but they're being overplayed by core, and maybe in their views they'll say this.
Well, they're not just being overplayed, they're also only invoked in one direction. They never talk about fee estimation getting better if you have spam filters. They never talk about block propagation slowing down, punishing miners that want to include crap in their blocks. They never talk about that. They always just assume, yeah, mining is totally centralized. Therefore, all that you can do with a block full of garbage is get a bigger advantage as a centralized giant miner, because everyone else now is at a disadvantage for it being slower verifying them. But that attack is always possible, even if we relay maximal amounts of crap around the network. They can just send their block out 5 seconds later than they actually find it. It's that simple. So it's not a real thing.
It's being overplayed by shitcoiners and spammers because they want to make it easier to spam, or they want to make Bitcoin a database and not money. That's kind of their argument. What's your...
What I just said is so utterly ridiculous for them to ignore that and to talk about, I'm glad Stephan's bringing this up, because it is infuriating that they keep bringing up these arguments about UTXO bloat and minor centralization and fee estimation, because initially I had a bunch of it wrong. I had my technical understanding had to improve a lot. And the more it did, the more I realized these guys just weren't even looking themselves. They just took these things and used them as lazy rationalizations for, again, what is ultimately just cowardice.
Or perspective on that?
I don't think that the arguments for minor centralizations from people that are contributing to Bitcoin Core or contributed to Bitcoin Core in the past are overblown. I think minor centralization is probably one of the biggest issues of Bitcoin right now, and making it worse is going to be pretty bad. Like, if we have very centralized mining, we do not have censorship resistance anymore. If we don't have censorship resistance anymore, Bitcoin is entirely uninteresting.
Yeah, mining centralization is terrible, and the only people that are doing anything to fight it is Ocean, and they are public enemy number one because they are also anti-spam. None of you guys are serious about mining centralization. You play politics, not Antoine specifically, but when we released Datum, which has actually worked and done what Stratum v2 has been pretending it was going to be capable of doing since 2019, and then whatever it was called before 2019, it never did squat, and it's rubbish. So none of these people actually care about centralization in mining. The team that does is anti-spam, and you'll use mining centralization because it's convenient in providing a little gotcha in saying that, oh, this will make mining centralization slightly worse. Okay, well, let's just relay maximum amounts of crap around the network then, and just hope that products like Slipstream stop being a thing, and that those miners don't consolidate and get even bigger. Let's just hope that that happens. Is that your solution to centralization in mining, and you'll just let the current status quo continue? When we released Datum, Matt Corallo came out and it wasn't anything like, well done, I'm interested to see how this works. I'm curious, you didn't use Stratum v2. It was just, how dare you not use what I wrote? We didn't use what you wrote because it's shit, Matt. That's why we spent months writing our own protocol. That's why we did that. And if you want to take offense to that, rather than look in the mirror and go, maybe I should have done a better job with this thing, that's your problem, okay? But you don't get to pretend that your ego isn't what's important and mining centralization is, because you couldn't care less about centralization of mining. You care about your own work being what people use and getting the credit for it. But you've done nothing to help centralization in mining at all. The words datum have never left your mouth because it's too insulting to you to acknowledge it as being the actual solution to the problem of centralization in mining. It's all just politics, guys, and it makes me sick.
Like, you might as well use other types of money that can be censored and are much more effective than Bitcoin if you're going to lose the censorship.
Yeah, mining centralization is bad. Let me know when you actually want to deal with it.
Censorship resistant aspect. So I believe concerns about minor centralization should always be taken very seriously just because of their impact. In addition, I think the minor centralization arguments are pretty well articulated and have very strong arguments for them with regards to trying to use standardness rules to change the demand for block space. And the last one, people trying to change Bitcoin for making it a database. Nobody is trying to change Bitcoin. Like, Bitcoin is what it is. We are not, like, nobody is trying to propose a consensus change. Bitcoin is what it is. Bitcoin users will want to use Bitcoin how they want to be using it. if we want to change some usage of Bitcoin, we need to change Bitcoin. So we need to change the consensus rules. There's no such proposal on the table, even from the fix the filters people, to change Bitcoin. So it's beyond the point. Besides saying that some people have motivation of making Bitcoin a database, or speculating on motivations is a waste of time. And
as I said, it's just Shinobi that keeps pushing this stupid, obtuse position that Bitcoin is just a database. And, you know, like I said, a jumbo jet and a kid's tricycle are both just transport.
Also trying to work it is also a red flag in discussions, because it's like trying to appeal to resentment and emotions instead of...
Hey man, I'll take ownership of that. It's a political ugly battle, but I will contend that my side has the high ground here. We're not the one that keep accusing you guys of being insane. The worst thing I'll say about core devs is that there's hubris there and some economic illiteracy. I'm not sitting out here going, ooh, Luke is insane. Look at this thing he did that makes Bitcoin not work after 2 years unless you intentionally want to run old software, which is actually a really good idea. Like, the character assassination has been all from the core side, and it's all been reminiscent of COVID trust the science stuff, because everyone just keeps saying, including Stephan, look, man, all the core devs disagree with you. And I'm saying, so what? The experts disagree with me in context that I end up, having sufficient amounts of heuristics to counter and make a correct choice that ends up being right. Just because a guy in a white lab coat says I need to do X, Y, Z every day doesn't mean it benefits me to do it. And specifically in Bitcoin, I know all the people here, and I can use Greg Maxwell's old arguments against his new spam apologetic self. I say, what happened to the old Greg? We used to care about this stuff. We used to think that nodes ran the network, not miners. So I just don't buy it. I've been through a war in Bitcoin, and it was Luke against all of Bitcoin Core, and Luke was right, and Luke won. So that is just the exact same situation here. The spam wars is Luke versus the rest of the core devs. So I'm not going to have anyone invoke some sort of collective technical consensus. 97% of core devs agree that countering spam does nothing. In fact, it just creates all these horrible second-order effects. I don't care what those guys say. They might as well be climate scientists to me. I don't believe these people. They don't have the credibility that people are affording them.
Logical, objective arguments. And they don't want to change Bitcoin because nobody is trying to change Bitcoin. Well, some people are trying to change Bitcoin Core. I do.
Which does change Bitcoin. So he's gone from saying Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin are not the same thing to saying we can leverage the fact that Bitcoin Core is basically Bitcoin back to saying, look, we're just changing Bitcoin Core, that we're not changing Bitcoin. He's flipped on that now twice.
Because I think it would be a better change for Bitcoin Core users. At the end of the day, if Bitcoin Core does not adapt to the demand for Bitcoin, it will be replaced by something that adapts to Bitcoin demand.
No, as already pointed out, Bitcoin Core, the only migration away from Bitcoin we've ever seen is towards a client that has more spam filtration, not less.
Back to the show in a moment. This show brought full off all advice is to if news to get looking and news is to get and Bitcoin drawing there. We'll go to the website galloy.io.
Just skipping the sponsors.
And now back to the show. Okay, and so essentially what you're drawing there is a distinction between Bitcoin, the overall protocol, let's say the consensus, and Bitcoin Core, which is merely one client, though it is the dominant client or server or software that drives that network. So it's, I guess you're trying to draw that distinction there, whereas let's say the filter guys are saying things like, Bitcoin Core should tighten standardness rules. It should do more to do things like stopping the current version of the taproot inscription envelope, or to stop bare multisig and stop this data carrier size issue and some of these aspects. So that's kind of my understanding of this. Now, I mean, just for listeners' sake, I'm trying to obviously reflect the concerns that I'm hearing in the community, but for me personally, I think while I see issues in terms of the kind of the GitHub moderation and maybe the communications of it, I think most of the core developers are technically correct and sort of reflecting the reality of the network. So personally, I think Bitcoin core developers are kind of it's kind of like people are shooting the messenger when the reality is there's maybe not so much that can be done about the spam, but we're going to talk a bit about some of those concerns, because some people, maybe in their view, think that if...
It's just complete denial of reality. We've had spam filters forever, and 99% of what's in the chain is economic, real Bitcoin activity, and it's because of spam filters. Pretending they don't work is new and unproved.
Bitcoin Core was doing more that you could stop the spam, per se. This
is mRNA technology, guys.
A filter position, let's say. And so, I guess, a filter position that I seem to see is They sort of say, if enough people ran filters, let's say they ran knots, then
Look, if one person runs filters, it's something I'm going to do, and it doesn't have any trade-offs I particularly care about. I do think they're overblown, and I explained why. And when he starts going on about minor centralization, I'm just rolling my eyes, because none of these guys really care about it, and you're not going to solve it by relaying more trash around the network. So one guy running filters is fine. And if a whole bunch of people feel like me, then those junk transactions are way less likely to end up in the chain.
miners who mine spam are effectively being penalized on their block propagation. What do you say? What do you think about that?
Ah, he brought that up. That's good. He's saying miners that mine blocks full of trash are going to be penalized a little bit by the network. It's not that the other miners suffer, it's that the miner that did it suffers. Antoine didn't mention that at all as like a sort of left hand, right hand position on it. He just says unequivocally running filters makes things worse for the filterer.
I don't think it's very persuasive as an argument.
Or in other words, would it be like...
If it's not persuasive as an argument, then it's not persuasive in the other direction either. Because guess what? Requesting a bunch of unknown transactions from a compact block takes, I think, tens of milliseconds, if not less than that. It's so quick that, I mean, you've got network latency in the first place, right? But, I mean, it's not really making a significant difference in either direction.
What level of, let's say, NOTS adoption or filter client adoption would we need to see before it actually started to make a real difference? Do you have a guess or an idea of that, or no?
I don't think it's going to make much of a difference, to be honest. And in any case, what matters is the propagation between miners. Miners are going to be incentivized. So what they want is always a superset.
In the world Ocean is building, miners are nodes. Nodes are miners. You don't get to have two categories here and just utter resignation to the fact that Bitcoin mining is centralized. So you have only 10 nodes or 10 groups of nodes run by the same 10 entities that are responsible for everything that goes in the blockchain. Yeah, if those guys build up fat pipes to each other and sharing blocks between them that contain a bunch of garbage that the network doesn't know about, and some 11th guy wants to come along with 0.1% of the network and he has a worse time of it, yeah, we're screwed. But we're only screwed because mining is already centralized. If mining's decentralized, these guys need to operate outside of those walled gardens. They have to.
Because you can have many implementations that all have different policy roles, different standardless rules. And miners are incentivized to have a set of policy that englobes all of them, because then they can get the feeds from all the various sub-relay networks. And in this case, well, they're going to include all the transactions, including the spam ones. And therefore, they're probably going to want to be connected directly to each other. And therefore, it won't have any effect whatsoever on propagation to miners. It might have different effects on propagation between users, but it would be a matter of seconds. And matter of seconds is only going to matter for miners and not for users.
Okay. And so, yeah, I guess...
He's just saying mining is centralized, and we need to accommodate that fact by making sure we relay as much garbage as possible, so as not to disadvantage anyone that's never going to be able to fix that situation, but we don't want to make it slightly harder for them if they try.
Important context for listeners who maybe aren't as familiar. There's this thing as an example.
And also, if we're centralized like that, by the way, and the network is not relaying around a certain kind of thing that one giant miner keeps putting in blocks, we can just go to that miner and say, can you stop doing this, and make a public backlash against them that affects their share price. This is already proven. We did that with Mara. It was just the flip side, where they kept excluding, or they stated their intention to exclude OFAC compliant, OFAC violating transactions. So they started making these OFAC compliant blocks. And that was probably an economically rational thing for them to do, at least on the advice of their legal department, that said, if we over comply to this extent, we will save ourselves a bunch of headache. And the public backlash meant they just stopped doing it. And you can immediately, and the basis of that was, we relay this stuff around the network, and you're not putting it in blocks. Why are you doing that? We're outraged. And now we get to just do the exact upside down version of that, which is, we're not relaying this stuff around the network. Why are you putting it in blocks? Stop doing that. Mara can just kill it. We'll just say, stop doing Slipstream. We're furious with you, and now all your investors are getting uncomfortable because of all this public backlash, and you stop doing it. Again, Slipstream's only possible if you have a massive percentage of the Bitcoin network to the point where you can make those kind of guarantees to spammers that need to get in the chain in a reasonable amount of time. That puts a target on your back for public backlash. and we can outcry and make you stop doing stuff. Again, I don't see any point in pretending we're not centralized on Bitcoin Core and that mining isn't already centralized. Centralization is really efficient if you want to bully people into doing what you want them to do. There is no point pretending we're decentralized in those realms when we aren't. And if Mara want to do asshole stuff and undermine the network, we go to them in meat space and we punish them for it. It doesn't need to be done at the network level. But if you're running spam filters that demonstrably block the kind of activity that they're doing, you get to point to that and say, why are you guys violating the intentions of the network? You can point to that. If you don't have spam filters, you can't point to anything. You're just saying, I don't like this stuff. So at least if you have a semi-effective technical method for preventing spam, you can point to that when it comes to a massive centralized entity that is demonstrating why they're only semi-effective, and you take it over the finish line. You say, okay, we're not preventing you from doing it completely on a technical level, but you guys are still having to go around us and work against the intentions of the network. Stop doing it. And that's exactly the rationale we have for saying you can't censor OFAC stuff. You can't do that. And we told them they couldn't do it, and they stopped, and the CEO got fired over it. You can do exactly the same thing with spam. It's a practical approach to fighting spam. Spam is just, how can we get this stuff to be less than it currently is? And every step of the way with this, you just have these idiots going, well, there'll still be some spam. I don't care. If there's less, it's worth it.
Mara is running this thing called Slipstream, which is like a private, kind of like a private mempool or a private API that people can submit non-standard transactions that are consensus valid but not policy valid or whatever, not relayed. And it's been known that this is like a thing people can do. Like I think F2Pool has done this kind of thing in the past. And so there's kind of a concern there that this private mempools is a concern just generally. That's kind of one thing people have spoken about. But the point here is more like, if you increase the filtering on the relay network, it's going to drive people to use like Mara Slipstream, or another thing is a one-off kind of implementation called Libra Relay by Peter Todd, which also is kind of like a more
run garbage man, people.
Openly relaying thing. And so as I understand, it would be like really difficult to actually stop the propagation of these things, because you would need to get like a really, really high supermajority of, let's say, filtering clients, whether that's people running knots or something like that, to actually stop these transactions propagating. Is that fair to say, or what do you think about that?
I think as long as these transactions are going to be consensus valid, you have two choices. Either there is significant economic demand behind them, or there is not. If there is not, it's not a problem in the first place. They're not going to be using any block space whatsoever. They don't like, you can try to filter them. That's probably going to work because there is very little demand behind them. If there is significant demand, such as we have seen with Ordinals, which is hundreds of Bitcoin, like forking Bitcoin Core and changing the size of a variable, like the value of a variable, sponsoring even a developer.
Yeah, but who actually runs any of that stuff? More than 90% of the network is still Bitcoin Core, and the remainder of it is all Bitcoin knots, and then there's a bit of change.
Bitcoin protocol developers using alternative implementations. It's not so hard to do. So as long as there is economic demand behind it, you're always going to have either people routing around the public relay network, or having separate public relay networks that are being built. And miners are always going to be incentivized to be using the more liberal relay network, as long as they don't get dust, to get more fees. So yeah, I don't think that even if everybody was running nuts, like let's say Bitcoin Core in 2023 merges Luke Jr.'s pull request to match inscriptions, which is the exact structure you detailed at the beginning that they are using in the script to store their data. People don't really pay that much attention because of Bitcoin Core's track record. They upgrade to the new version of Bitcoin Core, or they might even think that it's marginally good thing to do. They upgrade. And now the whole public and confirmed transaction relay network does not accept inscriptions anymore. People are just going to move to using a website, such as Slipstream, instead of running their Bitcoin nodes.
Yeah, like that's no big deal.
And sending the transaction through the public relay network. They're just going to send a website. If there is no website,
there's going to be less of them. If you dig up the road, then there's going to be less traffic.
And you have hundreds of Bitcoin of demand for direct access to miners. You're going to find a miner that is going to take your hundreds of Bitcoins and mine your transactions. And you're going to have people that are going to start building infrastructure for you for portions of these Bitcoins. And you're going to have people that are going to build the open source software that is going to create a new peer-to-peer relay
It can only happen at a scale where we can counter it at the social level.
network to propagate your transaction, and miners are going to be connecting to it. It's like, I think a good analogy here would be, let's say we have the Bitcoin Core GUI, and we have a button to send to a specific address. And there is one address that we don't like. It's like some sort of terrorist organization or whatnot. And then one group is saying, oh, if we change the Bitcoin Core GUI to just refuse sending to this specific address, people are going to stop using Bitcoin to send to this specific address. I think it's completely delusional. People are just going to fork the open source project, remove the check for this specific address, and let people send Bitcoin to this address because Bitcoin allows it. If Bitcoin allows it, trying to change it to Bitcoin Core is not going to change the behavior of Bitcoin Core users. Of Bitcoin users, it's going to change the adoption of Bitcoin Core. And when people are saying that, oh, if only Bitcoin Core adopted this new policy because it is the dominant implementation, they're flipping the argument on its head. Bitcoin Core is the dominant implementation because it matches the economic demand for...
No, it isn't. People are only moving away from Bitcoin Core because it lacks modern filters. They're not moving away from it because it has too many filters. You're in complete denial of reality here.
The network. If it did not, it would not be.
Yeah, and...
That's so ridiculous. It's just, I can see what he says on paper being true, but it's not manifest reality.
There's this concern, I guess, the filter camp, the filter rollers, or whatever you want to call it, the filter guys, they have this view almost of, it's about the nodes, and if the miners mine spam, that we, the users, we, the nodes, should treat them as hostile. What's your perspective on that?
I think it's just yesterday, we are recording this on Thursday, May 15th, and just yesterday I was discussing with Jason from Oceans, very respectfully, and I think we got to the bottom of the disagreement, which is believing that we have a saying in French, which means on est un con. It means we is a prick, because you can always say we are doing this, or we are doing this. It just obfuscates what individual is going to do what exactly, and there is no we. If there was a we that could reach agreements on exactly what is valid and what the chain is going to be, we wouldn't need proof of work in the first place. So we can coordinate around a change in consensus rules. But that's a potentially risky thing to do, to change the Bitcoin protocol. But that's a we. That's all Bitcoin users change the consensus rules. But doing so to try to change the proof of work to fire the miners is not going to reset the incentive.
Okay, no one's talking about changing proof of work here. This is a tangential conversation.
That are in place in the system. Like you would need to find a new system than Bitcoin. Like changing the proof of work is not. Sorry, maybe I jumped to the conclusion. We should treat what you said is that people say, yeah, well, we should, if miners just act upon their economic incentive and mine these transactions, then we should treat them as hostile. And obviously the conclusion of this is, well, if miners are hostile to the Bitcoin users, we should punish them. We should fire the miners. We should change the proof of work. And that's why I was replying to this. It would have no effect. What you want is a different system from Bitcoin.
You have to. This is not relevant to this conversation, but you have to be prepared to do a power change. If the miners are acting maliciously, you have to be prepared to fire them. Otherwise, they run the show, and miners can't run the show. And every time people start thinking the miners do run the show, like in the fork wars and like now, it creates a rift in the community because nodes and miners have different incentives, and nodes are more important than miners.
Okay, yeah, and
so that's why you must be prepared to fire them. You have to be prepared to do that. That is a base rule of Bitcoin. If the miners are misbehaving, you have to be prepared to fire them. And it doesn't matter if it doesn't exist for the purpose of making miners rich. That is not why Bitcoin exists. Miners are service providers, and if they're not providing that service, you hire someone else.
To be clear, that this change to the proof of work is viewed as like that's like the nuclear last resort option, but it sort of comes up.
No one's changing POW to stop spam.
Up in some of these conversations because it's kind of like fire the miners, and that would be the theoretical way to quote unquote fire the miners. One other big point that's been coming up a lot is the UTXO set growth. So the UTXO set is the unspent outputs. There has been a large growth in this. I think in data size, it's like 4 gigs to maybe 12 gigs. It went from something like 70 million or 80 million outputs up to like maybe 200 at the peak, and maybe nowadays we're at about 170 million. To be fair, a lot of that was related to spam, ordinals, inscriptions, etc. BRC20, I believe, actually is the specific protocol that makes up a lot of that spam because of kind of a special dynamic about how they did like a deploy and a mint kind of, it was like a funny dynamic, but basically it created all these extra UTXOs. The argument from the filter camp is, well, Bitcoin Core is not serious about UTXO bloat because, they're making this argument that Citria and maybe other ZK roll-up startups are going to, quote unquote, spam our UTXO set, but they didn't do anything to stop this massive spam that already happened. They are unserious about stopping UTXO bloat. What's your thought? Or
that is me making that claim. So thank you, Stephan, for addressing Antoine with it.
Response on that?
Again, it's playing on the terms because it's confusing forever unspendable UTXOs with uneconomical UTXOs. Uneconomical UTXOs, such as created by BRC20, is spendable still. So it's not a forever thing. It only takes financial incentives, incentivizing them to spend.
Okay, so he's making a pedantic distinction between two types of UTXO bloat that is meaningless, again, once put in context. The UTXO bloat that occurs from fake pub keys is provably unspendable. They're not valid key pairs. The UTXO bloat that occurs from inscriptions is just a bunch of dust that sits just above the dust threshold so that it can, well, because spam filters work and dust limit is a spam filter. But his point is that they might consolidate at some point and reduce the UTXO set, which is true. They can do that, and I think that has happened to some extent, but the UTXO set still went from 4 gigabytes to 12 gigabytes. If it goes back down to 11 again or something, thanks to the fact that these aren't quite as bad in terms of UTXO bloat, that's not a get-out-of-jail-free card, Bitcoin Core. You still watched it triple in size and told us that a perfectly effective countermeasure wouldn't work when it would have. This is an excuse, and it's not a very good one.
And this output to relieve everyone or just doing to avoid annoying everyone else. It happened in the past. It's not ahistorical. Some people have been sweeping dust output in the past. But it's also unrelated to the up return output, but I can understand how, it's unrelated to the up return output exchange, but I can understand how they feel that, but Citria is never going to use the chain anyway. It's going to be 100 bytes, few times a year, let's say 1 kilobyte. And we have 8 gigs of UTXO set usage, which is not bloat because it's not forever unspendable. It's 8 gigs of usage that we dislike. And Bitcoin Core did not do anything against them. And they should filter inscriptions. Filtering inscriptions for BRC20 is also not going to be effective. BRC20 is a meta protocol. They're not using inscription to store a large amount of data. It's 100 bytes or 150 bytes that they use in the witness data. And if we filtered this specific use case, so either they would just, nowadays, given all the private bridges to miner, they could just use a website and broadcast through the website. But alternatively, what they could have done is just change the structure of this transaction. They don't really need to store the data. They just need to interpret the Bitcoin data differently, which is the meta protocol. And we cannot filter a meta protocol. So there was 8 gigabytes of usage of the UTXO set that was related to meta protocol. They turned out to be using inscription, but filtering inscription is not going to remove the demand for meta protocol, unfortunately.
No, it doesn't remove the demand for it, but it does create a realistic barrier that means that they have to exert more effort. It costs them more time and money in order to get around the spam filter. That's not nothing. You can say it's not effective, but you have to define effective. If it reduces spam a little bit, then that is somewhat effective. Again, I don't know. I think he's just taking it as a fundamental premise that it must be 100% effective, otherwise it doesn't work. And I think that's what he's talking about here. It can be mildly effective. It can be annoying for the inscribers, and that's all right. It's okay to annoy spammers and make their life a little bit more difficult. That is all you can ever ultimately do, and it's better than nothing.
And so there was a lot of, pushback and arguments back and forth, especially 2 years ago when Luke Dasher opened that, I think it's the infamous data carrier size PR. Now, the filter camp, the filter guys see that as, look, that was a bug that enabled this taproot inscription envelope. Bitcoin Core should have closed that loophole to at least try to mitigate the spam. What do you think about that? Is it just the same answer, the same thing?
I think, so again, this is a Bitcoin Core thing, and it's not it's allowed by Bitcoin. So you can change it in Bitcoin Core however you like It's not going to affect how Bitcoin works. I think charitably, we could say that
okay, we're back to
maybe
saying
if it was not standalone,
we're back to saying that Bitcoin Core is not Bitcoin. So changing Bitcoin Core does nothing because Bitcoin still allows it.
the Bitcoin Core in the first place, it would not have led to such hype to be created, and the hype itself created the demand, which made it basically impossible for Bitcoin Core to remove, to remove by standardness, because we would be shooting ourselves and our users.
He's already conceded that the fact that we're so centralized around core, we can leverage the fact that standardness policies are so widely adopted so quickly by virtue of how centralized we are around core, that we can use that, we can leverage it. And why can't we leverage it to make life difficult for inscribers? He just says, well, because it won't be effective. They'll do something else. They'll use Mara and all that. These are just excuses. Having to do that makes it worth it. And no, it doesn't centralize mining, and no, it doesn't mess up fee estimation. So they're just, I don't even get it. Is this not obviously self-contradictory to everyone watching me right now?
Users in the foot. So maybe had the standardness rules been tighter in the beginning, we would not have seen such economic demand. But
yeah, it's a sliding scale. The sooner you whack the mole, the less likely the mole is to pop up again, and the more time and effort it takes them to recuperate. If you just let it go willy-nilly, then you start building up thicker and thicker roads. There's now 10 roads that you have to dig up instead of 1. Dig it up quick. The sooner a stitch in time saves 9. But that doesn't mean that a problem becomes unfixable past a certain threshold. We can still very effectively make life annoying for inscribers today, after all this time.
But trying to remove it after the fact is going to lead to all the consequences that we already discussed. It's not going to...
The consequences which are all nonsense.
Prevent Bitcoin users from using Bitcoin. They're just going to switch to another implementation or whatnot.
They can switch to another currency. They can switch to another method that isn't as harmful. Well, by which I mean they can use a small amount of op return. They can just start hashing everything and do it that way. And that is the original olive branch, and I'm not going to be that mad if they do it.
And it's worthwhile, I'll just add a quick point. We have to be honest and pragmatic here. Even if, hypothetically, 2 years ago that PR was merged, people don't all update to the newest version of Bitcoin Core straight away.
More excuses.
Many people are on older versions. So in practice, what would it have been 27 2 years ago or whatever
It doesn't matter. The inscribers, the VCs investing in all these scammy startups have to deal with the fact that the latest version of Bitcoin Core treats what we're doing as malicious and filters it out. Good luck raising another $10 million in that environment. I don't care if there's still a bunch of people still running the version of Bitcoin Core from 2 years ago. It doesn't matter. The network is telling you it doesn't want this stuff. That makes it harder to raise the capital to get this spam to the point where it actually becomes something we have to care about. I don't care about one guy putting his wedding vow into op return. I'm not going to lobby Bitcoin Core to put a spam filter in place to stop him from doing that, or soft fork it to get it out of the chain permanently, or something like that. I don't care about any of this stuff. I'm just saying, if you reach a certain scale with it, where you gamify it, you spend months and months raising money and convincing people that you're not just another scammer, even though you are, we can counter that and make your life impossible very easily. It's not that difficult to play whack-a-mole here. The mouse is not, it's not cat and mouse where you have you can upgrade the cat and the mouse has to spend 6 months planning what it's going to do, and the entire time you can see where it's going to be in 6 months. I have a pretty good feeling about being the cat in that game.
Version, there'd be a ton of users who are still on 25, 26, 24, and those nodes would still see these transactions as standard, right?
Yes, and even at the time that Luke opened the port.
Who cares? The network is telling you it doesn't want this stuff. The latest version is saying, leave it, mate. And they're going to have to adapt to it. It's a headache for them, and they can stop being assholes.
There was already significant economic demand behind it. So it was already too late. But by the time it would have been released by Bitcoin Core, adopted by the network, it would have been way, way too late. So late, actually, that probably some would have refused to upgrade because they wanted this usage. And again, so you would have two different network. So because probably then they would get someone to implement some sort of preferential peering for their network that does not have the filtering. And same argument all over again. People would just use an implementation that does not have this filtering.
Okay. So again, if we don't make more permissive spam relays, if we don't allow by default more relaying of spam, people will move away from core. Again, the only migration away from core we've seen is to more spam filtration, not less. I'm flabbergasted that he would say that in the current environment.
Okay. Now, there was another related issue, we've touched on this before, but bare multisig. So as I understand, this is, and you can correct me again if I'm getting any of this wrong, this is kind of like an old school multisig, right? Like, it's not P2SH multisig, it's not like any of the, or pay to taproot, not music. It's like this old school kind of multisig. And some of the filter guys wanted to, again, make that non-standard. Why did Bitcoin Core not try to stop the bare multisig spam?
Because Bitcoin Core cannot prevent Bitcoin users from using Bitcoin. It's like the bare multisig usage is so unfortunate. It's people that are self-proclaimed attacks on Bitcoin that want to be using the Bitcoin network.
Bitcoin Core cannot prevent Bitcoin users from using Bitcoin by standardness policy, he's saying. He's already contradicted that so many times in this. I don't think I need to make the point again.
To its full potential to harm its users. Fortunately, there is limits in Bitcoin, not in Bitcoin Core. There is limits in Bitcoin to prevent the maximum.
There is activity that is consensus valid, that isn't permitted by the nodes, that you never see, because the nodes have these standardness policies that prevent it. There is a reason you don't see, you see, how many op returns are there over 100,000 bytes, which violates 2 filters, if not more? I'm sure there might be 1 or 2, but basically the fact that 99.999999% of op returns aren't that is not just because of the fact that it would cost them a couple of grand to fill up the whole block. That's not why that's not happening. It's because these spam filtration things have a massive impact on what Bitcoin looks like, on what's in its blockchain. And saying we can't stop Bitcoiners from using Bitcoin Core. It's just, again, denial of reality. And he agreed with me at one point in this, when he said we can leverage the fact that Bitcoin Core's standardness policies are going to be so widely adopted to make soft fork upgrades go more smoothly and certain other things. I don't know why he's happy acknowledging that, how centralized we are with Bitcoin Core in that context, but then pretending it isn't a thing when we would talk about upgrading spam filters. It seems inconsistent to me and in service of doing nothing about spam when we totally could, for the reasons that we are happy leveraging the fact that we have unilateral adoption of spam relay policy in other contexts, and we're happy to make use of it. Bear in mind, we can always win this. My side can always win this because we don't need it to be perfect. We don't need complete adoption. We just need it to be pretty widely there. And he said it's consensus, or you would need almost consensus. You have that with Bitcoin Core when it comes to new spam filters, because it's basically what everyone uses. It's it's not consensus, it's softer than that, but it's close. And that's why most of the blockchain's contents reflect what is not just consensus valid, but is also valid by standardness policies.
Usage of resources an evil user may have on everyone else. But these limits are pretty high. And as long as there is economic demand behind this type of transactions, trying to blind Bitcoin Core nodes from these transactions, it's just going to harm these nodes, harm miners running Bitcoin Core, harm users using Bitcoin Core, and not prevent these transactions in the first place.
Yeah, so I guess a similar kind of consensus of what we were talking about is understanding, okay, there's Bitcoin, the protocol, and there's Bitcoin Core, which is one client, admittedly the dominant client, but one client of the broader protocol. One concern I've seen from some developers on this is this quote-unquote cat and mouse game. And if I had to try to summarize maybe one of the key contention points in this issue between the NOTS filter guys and, let's say, most of the core developers in the Bitcoin technical community, is the NOTS people sort of see it like, yeah, we should play the cat and mouse game against the spammers, whereas as I understand, most of the core developers and Bitcoin technical people don't want to play this game. What's your view on this so-called cat and mouse game?
They've been playing it forever, and now they want to stop, and they're pretending that it never worked when it always worked, and they're justifying their negligence by saying it never worked when it always did.
Game or whack-a-mole game.
Yes, so my view is that it would not play out like a cat and mouse game, but I can describe it and explain why Bitcoin Core is like it. So the argument goes like that. The cat, which is here a Bitcoin Core, the Bitcoin Core client, and the mouse is people using Bitcoin in ways that we don't like. So what the cat is going to do is to try to change its standardness rules to match the template of script that these people are using in ways like that you described at the beginning, the up false, up if, and data, to not relay them through the Bitcoin Core public relay network. And the thing is that by nature of what Bitcoin Core is, it's a critical piece of infrastructure it's slow. It's slow to release. It's slow to have code reviewed for very good reason. And by its nature, the mouse here, the degens wanting to put JPEGs on chain, are just more swift to adapt. And they have an infinite amount of templates that they can use.
Yes, but adaptation itself is a pain, even if they can do it quickly. Like we already talked about, incompatibility with Ordinals v16 versus Ordinals v17. These guys, their stuff barely works anyway. It's so quick. Who's really going to play? The mouse wants to live, right? But what you guys are talking about here, what Core are playing apologetics for, again, they're treating it like rain. It's just inevitable. They're not paying attention to the resources that go into constantly having to run from this stuff. So it takes us 6 months to implement a new spam filter. So what? It's going to take them 6 months to rewrite their stuff, and it's going to waste a whole bunch of time and capital for the spammers.
Therefore,
it's worth it.
Trying to play the cat and mouse game is going to lead to Bitcoin Core having to publish much more frequent updates of the software.
No, you can do ephemeral spam filtration, but that is an unproven concept, so I'm not going to claim that with complete certainty yet. The Lua filters, that's coming, it seems.
So either new
then it would just be you download a file and you don't even have to restart your core node, you don't need to update it, it just has a new set of policies.
Binaries that people have to run, or that the software itself would auto-update, or auto-updating some sort of scripts for relay policy. And basically, Bitcoin Core's position is that's a red line. It's like, fuck no, we are never going to release a software that auto-updates through a central point.
That's a straw man. No one's saying Core needs to do automatic updates. That's obviously not acceptable.
Basically, phone back home updates what your software runs. It's like completely anti-ethical to what Bitcoin is, and Bitcoin Core refuses to do this. And yeah, basically not to say that's fine. So I think it's a non-issue because in reality, it would not play like that. In the reality is the mouse does not care about the cat.
Of course they do. They need the relay network. That is what the entire motivation about this Citria acquiescence is. We want to make it, they would prefer it if they didn't have to deal with a miner out of band. They really would prefer it. They would rather the network just relay this stuff around. In Citria's case, the on-chain footprint from it is tiny, but actually what they really need is, because it's a fail case, they can't be just using Mara and waiting maybe 10 hours for a block. They need it pretty much in the next block, which means they need our help, which means we can tell them they don't have it and that they have to redesign their product. We don't need to just bend over.
The mouse is a honey badger. If the cat is trying to filter.
No, they're not. They're giving these qualities of, invincibility to spammers. The spammers, we can give spammers headaches all day if we want. It's not that hard.
It's just going.
And the bigger they are, the easier it gets.
To use an alternative peer-to-peer relay network, it's just going to use direct bridges to miners. It's just going.
Yeah, they're just going to build a ton of infrastructure. If we don't let these guys drive down our roads, they'll just build their own parallel infrastructure with their own roads like it's nothing. Yeah, that's trivial, guys. We might as well just let them use all of our resources that are not for that purpose, because they'll just build their own resources otherwise.
Going to use Bitcoin in other ways than the way provided by Bitcoin Core.
I see. Yeah, and so...
Again, no one moved away from Core for any reason other than to get more filters, not less.
I guess, playing it out, just for argument's sake, if there were to be some kind of soft fork done to tighten consensus to be in line with policy, is that a hypothetical possibility, or is there some reason that's not practical? Is it just a really big lift for very little practical gain? Is such a thing feasible or even desirable?
So I think so my personal issue with this usage of Bitcoin is that it might be used for meta protocol, and meta protocol might skew the incentives of actors, specifically miners, in the Bitcoin system, because now they're incentivized by non-Bitcoin stuff, and that's really bad. Trying to limit the amount of stored data on chain by consensus, it's possible to reduce the amount of data one can store on chain. You can just, first of all, reduce the block size. Then you can reduce some technical fields that are used in the transaction and how it's serialized. Some of them allow for more or less flexibility in how they're used. But there's two things. First of all, you're never going to reach your stated goal of preventing arbitrary on-chain storage. You're only going to limit it.
I already called that out. All right, so that was from the initial, the very beginning of the whole clip. our stated goal was never to prevent it, which he is using to mean 100% effectively prevent. It was just to reduce it.
Second of all, do not even reach your stated goal. You're going to significantly alter Bitcoin's very core and how it works. And I don't think that most Bitcoin users would be very happy with this.
He's talking about forking or doing something way more drastic. That's not on the table right now. No one is discussing that kind of stuff.
Can you spell out what that would look like in practice? Does it mean transaction type whitelisting, reduced scripting capability? What would it mean?
I think the most obvious one is, first of all, reduced scripting capabilities. Get rid of the taproot annex, get rid of too large scripts, potentially only allowing some very small types of scripts. And then maybe if you want to go even further, trying to prove that data that you're putting on chain is actual valid data, such as, for instance, if you're going to put a public key, provide a signature along with it to prove that it was indeed a public key and not some garbage. That would significantly reduce the ability to use the protocol. It would significantly reduce the ability to scale the protocol. Flexible scripts are at the core of making Bitcoin more scalable and accessible to more people at the same time. And it would just be a significant change to Bitcoin. And I think our presumption should always be on not changing Bitcoin. I think we should be able to change Bitcoin if we have a very good reason, but the very good reason should be presented, and that's not it.
And
I just don't think forking is a good approach to preventing spam. Even if it would do a really good job of it temporarily, it's such a slow process that then the cat really is at a disadvantage. That's not cat versus mouse, that's nuke versus mouse, right? And we're not going to do that. Some of the stuff, though, is quite compelling and maybe stuff I would consider. I also kind of, just on a tangential point, I don't really agree that all this flexible, fun toys for the boys stuff that they're trying to get into Bitcoin is going to manifest in the ways any of them ever think it will. So Covenants is a great example, right? I love it all on paper, and in reality, I look at Taproot and I'm like, yeah, nothing. It's just not gonna. It's gonna be 5 years. No one will be using it. Like, the reason Bitcoiners are not gonna be sovereign and permissionless with their transactions is because they can't be bothered. It's not because we don't have the right technology inside Bitcoin. So the technology just becomes toys for the boys, and they always run the risk of breaking stuff when they keep merging these interesting upgrades. So I'm basically telling them, leave it, go away, stop trying to add 4 freaking opcodes to Bitcoin. It's not going to pan out the way you did. How many more examples of this do we need? Segwit, okay, worked great, but we did have one element of it blow up in our face with all the UTXO bloat from inscriptions, which was supposed to reduce UTXO bloat, right? The witness data, the witness discount was supposed to. So yeah, just a side point there. I think that's typically where I agree with the core devs. Actually, is that all of these like rabid covenants proponents that certainly beg to be understood and have some really interesting and compelling ideas are just not zooming out enough and knowing that 99% of people are going to leave their coins with third-party custodians, regardless of how cheaply and permissionlessly they could do so otherwise, right? It's not... The fact that people are buying ETFs today is not because we don't have CTV and CSFS. It's not. Be real with yourselves. It's not. It's because people don't want the responsibility.
I guess even in the extreme case, they could still spam the UTXO set, right? Like, they could just use valid signatures to spam the UTXO set in any case. So it would sort of like we would be like hamstringing ourselves significantly. So I think, okay, so there is this kind of broader mining decentralization idea, and as I understand, there are various efforts to try to maintain the public relays and the public mempools system. So do you want to touch a little bit on that? Because
the public mempool system, that's an interesting term.
That seems to be another concern that people have, that they're saying, well, you guys seem to be concerned about driving, the use of Mara slipstream and other things, but what about just general accelerators anyway? Is that not also a concern?
All of them are concerned, and this is why it's been a priority for the Bitcoin Core project to work on this.
There's nothing you can do about this, guys. Miners are going to start putting weird stuff in blocks, whether you like it or not, and you can sit there and say, but that wasn't what was in my mempool, all you like, and I have the most permissive mempool policies ever. Doesn't matter. They can still fill up a block with weird stuff. They can still mine an empty block. They still just might get unlucky and not find any blocks. You can't predict this stuff. Bitcoin's by its nature just says, if you want a miner to include your transaction, pay them loads of money, more than anyone else's that you might reasonably expect to be transacting right now, and you'll probably get in their block. Not that you definitely will. So, and out-of-band transaction fee accelerators, things like mempool spaces accelerator, all those things are going to exist whether you like it or not. And there's no way you can making us relay spam around the network does so little that it's not a thing that you can bring up in this context. Miners are going to do weird stuff. Big miners are going to say to giant exchanges, we will sell you block space at a discount in bulk. We can promise that we will find 20% of the blocks over the next 6 months. We will sell you block space at this rate. It's slightly above what you might normally pay, but if there's a fee spike, we'll still honor it. Right? This is commoditization of block space. It's going to happen, and it's not going to take much. It can take some reference from what's going on generally in people's mempools. There can be something that says we can get out of it. If the fees spike to 1000x, we can break our agreement here and include that, unless you want to pay for our premium package, where we will include Coinbase's, 20 megabytes per week of UTXO footprint. We will include that in our blocks no matter what. If you pay us this much money, we will include it with this threshold, below this threshold if you only pay us that much money. All this stuff is coming, and you don't get to prevent it by relaying trash around the network. It's not a thing. Stop pretending it's a thing.
For the past, I would say for the past 5 years, trying to find solutions to pinning issues, which drove people toward accelerator, or making RBF easier to use, which drove people toward accelerators as well. Or at the same type of issue that the concerns raised by core developers around changing Bitcoin core standardness rules to be different from what the Bitcoin economic reality is, because it would create minor extracted value.
Chicken and egg, mate. Economic realities reflect what's technically trivial at the moment. If you dig up the road, there will be less traffic. That is a fact. And if you build the road, traffic will start existing that never had a potential to exist before.
And it would. Basically what we want with Bitcoin is that to have miners that play on an even playing field, and they all compete only based on the hash rate, so only based on the expended energy. If they don't, then if X% on increasing your hash rate is not giving you X% more probability to find blocks, we have an issue. Because if it comes, for instance, from direct submission from your API, then you have an edge over the rest of the network. So it does not mean that entry on the mining market is entirely impossible, but it makes it significantly higher because miners have tight margins. And now a new entrant on the market not only has to compete on this tight margin, but also they do not have all the fees, and the existing miners on the market have the fees. So it's just a self-reinforcing force that drives not only centralization of mining, but also making the current state of miners sticky. It's a very good property of Bitcoin to have that new miners enter the market and all miners leave, and we want to keep it as such.
So, summing things up, we've gone through a lot of different arguments back and forth, but I guess let's...
That's some interesting points, but I mean, he describes an almost beautiful version of Bitcoin where the neutrality of it and us all playing on the same playing field is nice, and we can only really maintain that, or one of the elements of that is homogeneous mempools. And Bitcoin, you have to draw the line somewhere, and sometimes what miners are incentivized to do doesn't line up with what nodes are incentivized to do. And when you're in that situation, you get uncomfortable. Miners were not incentivized to merge SegWit, but nodes were incentivized to merge SegWit. So we compromised and did what the nodes want, and not the bad kind of compromise. I mean that in an ironic sense because we forced them to do what we wanted because they are not as important as us in this hierarchy. Same here. Nodes have no reason to relay crap around the network. And like I said, the weakest part of the core arguments here are the apparent concerns that come from filtering things more aggressively than other people might. And that's just that is something that miners might not like it, and miners might seek out of banned stuff, but that is ultimately less relevant issue. It's not going to undermine Bitcoin anything like to the extent that it would by making nodes, except that they have to keep placating spammers and adopting new strategies to try and play catch up with whatever economic reality is for a bunch of miners. Economic reality is what we say it is, and that needs to be respected. And you can invoke the technical, the lack of a technically watertight solution to that effect, but you don't get to say that there is just no improvement that is possible at all either. So that, I think Antoine's kind of whole arc of this podcast, 'cause it's almost finished, starts with basically this faulty premise that you can't really prevent it. Well, you cannot completely prevent it. Therefore, you're not going to achieve your stated goal, which was never the stated goal. It's just to reduce it, because nodes are incentivized to do that. And if that creates these second order effects of mining centralization, the conversations that need to happen around that are going to focus on far bigger fish that need to be fried than out of band stuff. I do think that steel manning them, in a few decades, it's going to be different. I do agree that things are going to change a bit, but for now, when 99% of what's in the block is subsidy, the transaction fees are irrelevant to anything. And setting up these out-of-band things to store scam stuff inside Bitcoin's blockchain to try and give you an edge over other miners is barely a net positive. It really annoys the network, and you can only do it if you're at a big enough scale where the network could just turn around to you and say, hey, Mara, piss off. And then, like we did before with OFAC compliance, and then they just stop. That's a realistic thing to do. People don't like it because it doesn't feel very Bitcoiny or cypherpunk telling people what not to do, but ultimately they're attacking the network, and we know exactly who they are. They're a giant incorporated US company. You can just go at them and bring the shit to their doorstep and say, we're not having this, and ask them to stop, and continue making outcry about it until, or you just not agree to protest things that way, unfortunately, because there's too many Bitcoiners that think it's, again, somehow virtuous, adding loads of junk to the chain that is just going to be stuff that we have to store forever. So I don't know. Let's let him round off here, because there's 7 minutes left, but I think a bunch of it's probably like plugs and product placement and stuff. So hopefully it's almost over and we can move on with our lives.
Let's try to summarize the key arguments, because we've kind of covered a lot of technical ground here. But there's the specific op return issue, and then there's the broader spam filter wars kind of debate. So on this op return issue, what do you think is the likely path forward? And I guess while we're here, one concern raised by people is, look, is it worth all this drama for a very minute, small fix?
Is it worth all the drama? So I said on Twitter yesterday that in hindsight, I would have rather spend my time on something else because it has pretty limited impact than spending my time tweeting.
Wide open, mate. Feel free to close the PR anytime, though I know it isn't your PR, but knack it. Not worth the time.
But also, I'm not sure. I think it just unveiled something that was already there. There was miscommunication between protocol developers and lack of communication between protocol developers and Bitcoin enthusiasts.
There's no amount of communicating that will make us all right with it.
Yes, I don't want to say Bitcoin users because there's so many Bitcoin users, and nowadays that the Bitcoiners are a small part of them. But they are a very important part of Bitcoin users, and we should have better communication between protocol developers and Bitcoin enthusiasts. And I think my proposal, in the very casual manner that I made it, without prepared communication, engagement with the community, because I was just, it's a boring change and it's obvious. Well, it was not to everybody. And maybe it was good to do it now and have all this drama, hash it out, rather than having it, I don't know, further down the road where the perception are even further split.
It's never going to go away. The spam wars, spam is a perennial problem. And the ideological gaslighting that goes on every time we have to try and prevent it is just this perennial struggle. So when spam came around, Luke was like, all right, here's the filter, run it. And I can't be bothered to discuss this stuff with you idiots because I've done it before 10 years ago. And that's exactly what happened. Go back to the old threads where Satoshi Dice was annoying everyone and people were like, okay, here's how we filter it. And then you get a bunch of idiots and just mindless ideologues that are like, isn't that censorship though? And, I thought this was a permissionless currency, and all these stupid arguments. You're not allowed to defend yourself, otherwise it's censorship. It's just they don't know how to apply the appropriate moral principles appropriately. And they just fail at it, and they invoke all these stupid arguments that basically mean you're forced to do stuff on other people's behalf, otherwise somehow you're immoral. That's all it comes down to. And then they say, well, you're not forced to run the latest version of core, because they're happy denying the fact that you have to run the latest version of core or something incredibly close to it, which is something like NOS. And I hate that. I hate the flip-flopping between the fact that Bitcoin Core is basically Bitcoin and that, wait, I'm not in control of anything, because even though I have write access to Bitcoin Core, if you don't like what I write, you can just run something else or you can fork it. This isn't Linux. It doesn't work that way in Bitcoin. Basically, we all have to run pretty recent versions of Bitcoin Core, if not the latest. Unless someone was capable of writing software 10 years ago without any bugs in it, which is never a thing. So let's let him round off.
So I'm not sure.
He's not sure.
So in terms of...
He's not sure whether he would have done this again in retrospect. He considers it a waste of time, not that important. Maybe he'd have done something else and he didn't realize it was all going to blow up. See, I think that points to the essential naivety here, because the blow up is not over nothing, and it's not pure rhetoric, as he said, either. There is a genuine contradiction in the presentation of spam filters and their effectiveness. And that is not being used as we're comparing apples and oranges and pretending they're the same thing. No, they actually directly contradict one another in principle and in practice.
Where do you think we're going on op return? Like, is it likely that, let's say, InstaGib's PR is going to be merged and that the default of op return will be raised to 100 kilobytes and that it will likely be deprecated? Or do you have a view on that, or do you know or no?
I don't know. Nobody knows for sure because it depends on coordination among many people. So far, Greg's pull request seems to have a lot of support from active contributors. My personal opinion is that we should hold off for a bit, work on the communication. So that's what I did in the past week. I published...
Just play a bit more politics. Eventually the plebs will be all right with it.
These detailed... addressing all objections from the community.
And that will be in the show notes for listeners, so you can check that out. It's over at Delving Bitcoin.
Yes. So we should work on this. Hold off the change for now. There is no rush for merging it. Like, it makes no difference if we merge it today or in 1 month. So we can just hold off, better communicate our views, address concerns or objections, even if they are not the most correct one, and then move on with the change if we still think it's the best way forward. So that's my view. What is going to happen is outside of my control. I can try to influence it. I'm going to raise my opinion, but the project is not just me. So we'll see.
So yeah, just back off a bit. We've pissed off the hornet's nest. We'll probably try and do it again a bit later when there's a news day, another news event that takes people's minds off this. But I don't think it will. It's been many weeks now of this fight, and we've been leading up to this for years with the lack of action around inscriptions. This one's got legs. This is not a flash in the pan.
And on the sort of broader spam kind of issue, where do you have any idea where that's going to end out, or you don't really know? It kind of depends on what people are saying.
So on the issue of broader unwanted usage of the chain, my main comment, and I think it's something that is common to many problematic in Bitcoin today, is just that, unfortunately, there's not a lot of demand for using Bitcoin at all. Not a lot of people want to use Bitcoin. If we had more usage of Bitcoin, it would make it significantly more expensive for people like Stamps, for instance, who try to spam the UTXO set to do it. And maybe it would bring a cost enough, like a high enough cost, to disincentivize their meme behind it. For inscriptions, same. Inscriptions are extremely large. So raising the fee rate at which they need to be included will have an effect. Raising it from 1 to 6 sats per vbyte, for instance, as done by Slipstream, it's not going to do anything. But if there is active demand for Bitcoin's block space and the next block fee rate is constantly 100 sats per vbyte or 200 sats, then it's going to make them think once or twice before storing their JPEGs. So
Baseless assertion, again, opposite of reality. The theory is people using Bitcoin will price out spam. Again, spammers can just as easily price out people using Bitcoin. And remember, inscriptions get this 75% discount as well in current state of affairs. Historically, there is more and more spam in the chain and less financial activity. So anyone still making the claim, like Lynn Alden does, that I'm not worried about spam, eventually it will get priced out. They have no basis for that assertion, and it seems to, the exact opposite seems to be happening. Instead, you're getting, rather than this self-sustaining network where the incentives all pull together, you have the opposite. You have abuse, tragedy of the commons scenario where people are just saying, oh, wow, I can get a bunch of idiots to store my data for free forever. I'm just going to abuse and abuse and abuse that until the whole thing keels over.
I think that's my broader take. I also think that it's a fade. It's a hype. We've seen it. It's going to fade away. Well, I'm afraid that it's taking back on now.
Nope. I've been waiting for shitcoins to die for my entire adult life. It's not happening. Death, taxes, and shitcoins.
Because of all the drama from the filter people around my proposal that is entirely unrelated to inscription, because they made it to be about inscriptions. Now the inscription people are...
This is all just pointing to like ideological, theoretical arguments. Not ideological, but theoretical. Oh, in theory, the spam will eventually get priced out. Right? It's not actually happening in reality. In theory, if Bitcoin Core doesn't contort itself to what the miners are doing, it will be disadopted. In reality, no, everyone just moves towards knots. Well, not everyone, but that's the biggest migration we've ever seen. These are all just like, these are things and theories that look good on paper, but aren't matching reality.
All over it again. They're making JPEGs of my tweets and whatever.
Yeah, it's a fad. The scammers will just get bored and move on. Yes, but then there'll be a new breed of scammer. There's always another sucker walking into your casino that can't do maths. Always.
Bullshit. So it just revive them. If we just ignore them and stop trying to revive them.
Don't defend yourself, because then you're responsible for any escalation in the conflict.
And making it bigger than it is. It's just going to die off. It's just a fade.
It will die off. It will just reiterate.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, thanks for joining. I know you've got to run, but I guess if I had to summarize a few of the key points here, it's understanding the difference between the op return specific proposal on this PR and the mailing list discussion versus the broader inscriptions and broader spam filter conversation, and also understanding the difference between Bitcoin, the protocol, and Bitcoin Core, the admittedly dominant reference client of Bitcoin, but it's not the only client. And I guess one other question around implementations, right? Because there's Bitcoin Core, there's Knots, there's LibBitcoin, there's BTCD, Floresta, I think Bitcoin JS, maybe there's a few others out there that I can't think of right now. What do you think happens there? Do you think there will be, disgruntled users who will go to Knots, but most of the network will stay on Core? Do you have a view on that?
I don't know. I don't think that LibBitcoin has any published binaries, so I don't think it's an option for people. I'm not sure about Bitcoin JS. I'm not sure about the state of the project there. I know that BTCD works. I know that it has a lot less eyes on it, and it's a complete re-implementation of the protocol. So I would advise against using it. People want to use something, at least use Nuts or Libera Relay. I would advise against using either of those for different reasons, but at least they are very, very likely to be consensus compatible with Bitcoin Core.
All right, well, thanks for joining, and thanks for...
Bitcoin Core is not Bitcoin, but also you can't run anything that isn't Bitcoin Core.
Helping explain your view. I'm sure this is not the end of this conversation. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of back and forth, but nevertheless, thank you anyway, and we'll...
I'm not trying to take cheap shots. I know why they're trying to make a distinction there, and sometimes it is valid. But again, I hate the flip-flopping between the fact that whatever Bitcoin Core does basically manifests. The blockchain is what Bitcoin Core basically says it should be. And that's not Bitcoin Core contorting itself. That's people finding use cases that the network is conducive to. It's a database, but it doesn't contain a copy of Disney's Aladdin. Why? Because it's not conducive to that kind of data storage. It's not for that. And Bitcoin Core is designed to that effect.
Well, I'll see you in...
All right, it's finished. Thanks for watching. I might debate Antoine if he's interested. He's probably, like I said, I don't have... There are people I dislike far more on the pro-spam, the spam apologetic side of this whole argument, like Shinobi and Blue Matt and Peter Todd. I find their arguments way weaker and I find Antoine actually to be a lot more sincere. I just think he falls into traps where he says, this is in theory how Bitcoin works. And then you hold up a mirror and say, well, that obviously isn't how it works. And then you have these sort of naive admissions about meeting up with someone from Citria and sort of telling them, hey, we'll modify Bitcoin to, could you please use it this way if we modify it in time? And they're like, well, we'll think about it. Like that's naive, telling the world that you're doing stuff like that, because that's going to make people go insane, and quite rightly, because it just seems like, the fox is in charge of the hen house on that one. And yeah, the initial premise is just basically like he says a lot of valid stuff there, let's be honest. But the two things I take biggest issue with are there are concerns if you filter spam, it's going to make things worse for you somehow. And he said he doesn't think it's overblown, and then goes on a big rant about how centralization for mining is terrible. And I'm saying this is a joke. Please stop using a very serious issue to try and be a convenient political football in this debate. And then the other thing is the initial straw man. Like, you're not going to achieve your stated goal of getting rid of all spam. And he says prevent. All you can do is limit. So I have to take that to mean that he thinks prevention means 100% effective prevention. And no one has ever made that claim. That is always the people pushing back. It's always the apologists saying, you'll never completely get rid of it. And we're saying, we never said we could. And I don't know how many times I've had to say that over the last 2 years. I don't think spam filters get rid of all spam. No one on my side thinks that. We just think it reduces it, and thus it is worth doing because the trade-offs are overblown and nonsense and expressed by people who demonstrably are playing politics instead of being actually interested in solving problems like UTXO bloat. And they want to make this meaningless distinction between technically spendable bloated UTXO set and completely unspendable, and centralization of mining. Either way, come and talk to me when you're serious about those problems, guys. I have solutions for you. Stop playing politics with them. There's nothing wrong with filtering. We've done it forever. Stop pretending they don't work. Stop pretending there's all these new fallout. There's all these second-order undesirable consequences and trade-offs to filtering. There aren't. All you're doing is getting rid of them because they work, and I don't use that in a rhetorical capacity. They work for the intentions which we said they would work for inscriptions, which was they would make life more annoying for the people trying to do it. Just like the op return limit at the moment makes life more annoying for people that want to store, multiple kilobytes of op return in the chain. It's made more annoying by a spam filter, just like inscriptions would be more annoying if we'd implemented the filter for those. It's a sliding scale. The longer you wait for the market to establish itself, the more traffic there is on the road before you dig it up, the more precarious it's going to be, but it will always undeniably have some kind of effect. It just won't completely eliminate it, which was never our stated goal, and it was inappropriate to say that is. I don't know. Antoine is way better than to make that straw man argument, so I don't know why he starts with. He didn't start with that. Stephan put it at the beginning as a sort of, entertaining clip, but that is basically Antoine's position. So anyway, if me and him end up having a back and forth in live sometime, I think Guy Swan might host it. I'm very up for it. As I said, I prefer the arguments he makes. He seems a lot more genuine than the other people I had to debate at BTC++ and that whole clown show there. So we'll see how it progresses. And thanks for watching. I can't believe anyone would make it to the end. I'm sorry it's so long, but it was a long interview in the first place, and I had to get all my responses in. Thanks.